The pink strands of her silky hair were scattered across the cold floor, and if she had only known that fate would lead her to such a sad end, she would undoubtedly have found a way to meet the Grand Duke earlier, hoping to change the future and save herself from this tragedy. The beautiful lady, whose beauty resembled a fragile flower with delicate petals, stretched her hands to the heavens, begging the gods to grant her a second chance, and her long, graceful eyelashes trembled as if from a light breath of wind, while the noble features of her face remained the seal of despair. Under the silent, starry sky, where the cold light of the heavenly bodies collided with the scarlet glow of the mysterious seal, time seemed to stand still, and at that moment, when the power of desire reached its peak, the invisible threads of fate intertwined, fulfilling the cherished dream. A man walked slowly across the frozen, silent snowfield, leaving deep footprints with his heavy boots, and each of his steps, echoing dully in the frosty air, seemed to be a harbinger of an inevitable meeting that could change the course of history forever. The beauty stood awkwardly before the stern man who, with a barely noticeable grin, asked if she had really come to him with the intention of entering into an arranged marriage, and at that moment it became clear to her that her ideas about her future husband might have been too naive. His face, covered with old scars, bore the marks of countless battles, and his thick black beard gave him an even more menacing appearance, as if fate itself had forged in him the image of a man accustomed to living on the edge between war and peace. A true warrior, whose long dark hair flowed, emphasizing his formidable posture, and whose scarlet eyes glimmered with warning, grimly said that she should think twice before deciding on such a reckless step, because his life was the path of the sword and not of palace balls. All her dreams of a noble, handsome duke collapsed in an instant when she realized that her betrothed would not be an elegant aristocrat at all, but this stern savage whose brute strength and frightening silence left no hint of romance. It was a story from a book about a heroine who mysteriously found herself in a fantasy world where she had to go through severe trials, realize her destiny, and meet someone she never expected to be her chosen one. A huge castle, wrapped in a blanket of snow, stood in the very heart of an ancient forest, surrounded by towers, high walls, and a silent guard of time, as if the kingdom itself was frozen in eternal anticipation of its true mistress. Wrapped in a heavy cloak with a fur trim, the girl walked through the merciless blizzard, feeling the icy wind sting her skin, and every snowflake falling on her face seemed like a harbinger of future trials that awaited her ahead. The Count's daughter, young Myrto, had agreed without hesitation to marry the formidable and merciless Duke of the North, hoping that this deal would bring her long-awaited happiness, and now, gritting her teeth, she walked through the blizzard, enduring the piercing cold and merciless snow. The heavy wooden door swung open with a deafening roar, as if to emphasize the inexorability of her fate, and an icy wind rushed into the hall, mixing with the reflections of the torches, casting shadows on the walls that foreshadowed a meeting that could change her life. Before her stood a true warrior, stern and unbending, and looking at her coldly, he demanded this meeting without further ado to warn her that her decision was rash, and that the marriage itself could turn into a disaster that she would bitterly regret. His eyes, scarlet like hot coals, shone with a frightening fire. They contained not only the severity of a seasoned fighter, but also something wild and primitive, which caused fear to flare up in her soul and her heart to shrink from the feeling of impending danger. The noble woman found herself drawn into the history of this world by pure chance, as if fate had played a cruel joke on her, but the gods, observing her trials, granted her one and only wish, with which she could change the course of her predetermined fate. On a raised pedestal covered in scarlet velvet rested a magnificent crown, its precious stones shimmering in the torchlight, and the finest carvings woven into the metal, a story of power destined only for the true ruler. Having knowledge of the events of the novel, the girl easily built a strategy, took power into her own hands, subjugated her rivals, and, without meeting a worthy opponent, effortlessly received the crown, turning into the arbiter of destinies. Now the sole ruler of the kingdom, the noblewoman subjugated the entire empire, skillfully using cunning, strength, and foresight, and her name no longer sounded like a weak plea for mercy, but like an order that no one dared to dispute. Quite quickly, Littera managed to find a worthy life partner, entering into a seemingly advantageous marriage with him, which was supposed to become a union. But reality turned out to be much more complicated than she imagined, because even a carefully planned fate can present unpleasant surprises. However, the heroine never lived to see the ideal ending, because in aristocratic circles her name was constantly on everyone's lips. Noble families whispered endlessly, discussing her every decision, looking for mistakes in it, condemning her actions, and impatiently awaiting her inevitable fall. The main character, who was supposed to become her reliable support, turned out to be a cruel despot, demanding unquestioning obedience, and the order sounded threatening. She had no right to look at any man except him, did not dare even think about attention from others. With an irritated expression on her face, Littera frowned darkly, realizing that her patience was already running out because she did not intend to be a puppet in someone's hands, much less obediently obey a man who considered her just a beautiful decoration. Without thinking for a second, the girl sharply raised her leg, forcefully pushing the impudent man out of the palace doors, sending him as far away as possible, because she absolutely did not need such a husband, and she was not going to allow anyone to impose their will on her. Littera took a tired breath, barely containing her anger, her fingers clenched at her temples, and suppressing the bitterness that washed over her, she asked herself the question that was tearing her apart from the inside. Why, among all these people, was there not one whom she could confide in and ask for help? The servant carefully handed the letter to the queen, but she, squinting with displeasure, asked with irritation who dared to write to her this time, since lately the messages had brought nothing but headaches and new problems that had to be dealt with. However, as soon as she heard that the letter was sent by the Grand Duke of the North himself, her irritation instantly vanished, and barely concealing her delight, Littera hastily snatched it from the servant's hands, anticipating the lines written by the hand of a man whom she had long considered her friend. With trepidation, she unfolded the snow-white envelope with a scarlet seal, quickly running her gaze over the elegant handwriting, feeling how with each word her heart was filled with pleasant warmth, because a message from an old friend always brought her joy even in the most difficult times. The lady couldn't help but smile as her gaze slid over the perfectly crafted letters, for each word, written with grace, seemed to reflect the author himself. A man whom others called a monster, a beast living alone in the harsh lands of the north. Other people, unable to understand the true nature of this mysterious man, whispered fearfully behind his back, calling him an ominous beast and a soulless monster, but in fact his name was Ferris, and he lived in complete solitude, hiding from the world. With a quiet joy, full of warm memories, the girl took a deep breath, feeling the familiar smell of old pages and candle wax, after which she slowly sank into a comfortable chair, indulging in thoughts about the man who was not only a loyal ally to her, but also a reliable friend. In a beautifully designed letter, written with sincere gratitude, she expressed her deepest thanks to him, putting all her warmth into elegant lines, and the envelope itself, made in white and blue tones, was sealed with an exquisite scarlet seal. He always answered her with unfailing warmth, choosing words so that they penetrated straight to the heart, and when the lady opened the letters, rereading the lines filled with sincerity and care, her soul was filled with a pleasant warmth, as if the light of the morning sun dispersed disturbing shadows. In Littera's slender fingers, sliding over the smooth surface of the paper, rested a refined blue pen, and, having barely touched the sheet, she prepared to write a reply, putting into each word not only gratitude, but also the full depth of her feelings. Having become a queen, she realized that she was able to overcome all the trials and withstand the pressure of those around her precisely thanks to the man whose support, coming from the distant cold north, became a reliable support for her, and his friendship turned into an indestructible force. Their correspondence lasted endlessly, filling long nights with the expectation of a new letter, and with each new message filled with warm words, a spark of hope flared up in the heart, and the pages, written with their thoughts and feelings, became a connecting thread between two souls. Cupping her face in her hand, Littera muttered into the void with a slight smile, as if addressing an invisible interlocutor, that perhaps they could at least meet in person once, because despite the correspondence that connected souls, a real meeting remained something distant. But the one who bore the blue emblem of power, the proud and unshakable Duke, invariably refused her this wish, remaining true to his unyielding position, because in the past his paths crossed with the former emperor, overthrown as a result of palace intrigues. The lady ran her fingers carefully along the edge of the letter, as if trying to touch his thoughts, and thoughtfully lowered her gaze, reflecting on how firm Ferris had been in his decision to avoid the meeting, not giving in to any persuasion or requests, as if there was an invisible wall between them. Often, in moments of loneliness, Littera, pressing her palms to her cheeks, allowed herself to dream about what the mysterious friend she knew about only from the lines of letters might look like, and tried to imagine his appearance, giving him features that seemed to her worthy of a man so noble. In her thoughts, he was always young, with the fine, refined features of a true aristocrat, hair as black as a raven's wing, in contrast to which deep red eyes sparkled, and in his whole appearance one could read impeccable cold beauty. It would be so wonderful to meet him at least once, to see him in person, to hear his voice, to feel his presence next to her, because she was sure that they would make an amazingly beautiful couple, two souls united by a common history, even if for now they were connected only by ink on paper. With a sudden blush on her cheeks, feeling her heart beat a little faster, Littera squeezed the thin pen in her fingers and, with her handwriting breaking from excitement, resolutely wrote out the stern words of the order on the sheet of paper, ordering that the Duke be immediately told that he was obliged to appear at the palace on urgent business. The noblewoman carefully wrote beautiful lines on paper in an elegant, confident handwriting, carefully choosing each word, and then, after thinking for a moment, gave the order for the man to finally come to her, because their long years of correspondence deserved at least one real meeting. But thinking that such a straightforward demand might seem rude to her friend, she suddenly felt doubts, clutched the letter tightly in her hands, crumpled it in her thin fingers, and sighing, did not dare to send these lines, fearing that his pride would not allow her to respond. The noblewoman took up her pen again, dipped the tip into the inkwell, and began to write the letter again, this time choosing her words more gently, and politely expressed the idea that their meeting would certainly take place, but only when Ferris himself was ready for it, and considered the moment appropriate. Having put a graceful period at the end, Littera put her pen aside, feeling a slight relief, and her snow-white gloves, stained with light traces of ink, reminded her of the indecision with which she had rewritten these lines several times. After this, the lady carefully folded the paper, carefully put it into the envelope, running her fingertips along the fold, as if sealing her feelings in it, and looking at the letter, finally understood that it was now ready to be sent and did not require a single more corrected line. At the top was placed a red seal, a symbol of power and the royal word, which could now not be revoked or taken back, for, sealed with her personal sign, the letter became an official message, intended for the one who alone could understand its true meaning. The queen silently handed the sealed envelope to her servant, nodded her head slightly, and in a clear, unquestioning tone ordered that the message be sent immediately to the Duke of the North, so that he would receive her polite but still insistent request, hidden behind the elegant turns of the letter. Rising from her seat, Littera gracefully walked through the majestic hall towards the exit, surrounded by luxurious carpets with intricate patterns, massive dark wood furniture covered in fine carvings, and heavy velvet curtains. Her graceful yet firm hand slid towards the window glass, and her fingertips paused for a moment on the cool surface, as if seeking comfort in this touch, but instead only coldness was reflected in her thoughtful gaze, filled with doubts and anxiety. Muttering under her breath, Litera thought that perhaps she should resign from her post as empress, since even she, standing at the head of a great power, could not achieve such a simple desire, to meet with the man who meant so much to her and whom she knew only from letters. The lady sighed heavily, lost in thought, but suddenly the silence was broken by the loud sound of a door swinging open, and after that she heard the alarming cries of the guards, drowned out by the hurried, booming steps approaching from the entrance to the hall. Her heart stopped for a moment, and her body froze in a slight numbness, when, realizing that someone was trying to force their way inside, Litera involuntarily took a step back, not understanding who exactly could dare to commit such audacity, because the walls of the palace were guarded. Heavy footsteps sounded in the silence, breaking the tense silence, and the door slowly creaked, letting a dark figure into the room, whose presence instantly filled the air with an icy tension, causing Litera's heart to stop. She turned around abruptly, her eyes widening in surprise, and her fingers reflexively clenching on the fabric of her dress, because behind her, as if appearing out of nowhere, stood a man wrapped in a long dark cloak, whose face was hidden in shadow, making his silhouette even more ominous. Her crazy ex-husband stood before her, with a mad smile on his face. He conspiratorially whispered that since he couldn't get her as a wife, he would now simply get rid of her, clutching a sword in his hands, which was already ready to pierce her heart, putting an end to this story. Litera recoiled in horror. A cold fear gripped her body, and before she could take a single step toward salvation, reality faded before her eyes. Life mercilessly left her, leaving only a void in which the sinister laughter of the killer was heard. But fate was kind. The gods heard her silent cry, giving her a second chance, and this time, realizing the full value of the opportunity given to her, she firmly decided not to repeat her previous mistakes, but instead to go to a man she could trust. But when her savior appeared before her, it was not the handsome young man she had pictured in her imagination, but a stern, grown man, clad in heavy black armor, with deeply scarred faces and eyes full of hidden menace. Before her stood Ferris himself, the formidable Duke of the North, the very man who had once warned her not to make hasty decisions, insistently advising her to think carefully before deciding on such an important step as marriage with him. Litera tried unsuccessfully to convince herself that everything that was happening was just a ridiculous joke of higher powers, but the expression of shock froze on her face, and realizing the irreversibility of the situation, she felt her dreams collapsing like a house of cards under a gust of merciless wind. It took her a moment to understand why the genre of the book she had found herself in had changed so quickly. It was supposed to be a magical fantasy, full of enchantment, beautiful heroes, and romance, and not this cold, gloomy world, permeated with a sense of imminent danger. Shifting awkwardly from foot to foot, Litera caught herself thinking that she was noticeably shorter than the man in front of her, and suddenly realized with uneasy clarity that she had not found herself in a beautiful romantic story, but in a cruel era, more reminiscent of the harsh Middle Ages. Her fingers clenched convulsively on the fur of her warm coat, and she pulled it closer to herself with effort, as if hoping that the thick fabric could protect her not only from the cold, but also from the hidden horror that ran down her back from the realization of her situation. Frowning, the girl tried to comprehend how she could have become the main character of this story, because everything that was happening seemed like an absurd misunderstanding that went against the usual plots about time travelers. Ferris narrowed his eyes warily when the beauty suddenly calmly stated that, before talking about the future, she wanted to first go to his ducal palace, look around, understand the situation, and only then decide what to do next. The man, before turning around and leaving, calmly but firmly warned her that he would not judge her if she decided to retreat, because he understood perfectly well that not every girl was ready to step into his world, filled with cold, secrets, and darkness, which scared off even the bravest. The beauty, without saying a word, carefully followed him, feeling how her dark blue dress glided softly over the crunchy snow, leaving behind a barely noticeable pattern. Her fur cape protected her from the wind, and the clouds of steam escaping from her lips immediately dissolved in the icy air. Litera herself tried her best to remain dignified and not show fear, but her heart sank with alarm at the realization that her companion, this stern man in dark armor, looked truly frightening, as if he were not a man, but a living embodiment of a menacing, merciless night. The walls of the mansion they were heading for seemed to be carved out of the cold itself, their severe stonework, devoid of any decoration, created not for beauty, but for protection, and inside there was probably nothing superfluous except what was truly necessary for a warrior and a ruler. Littera, barely holding back her trembling, looked around in surprise, but no matter how much she peered into the space around her, only endless darkness reigned everywhere, as if this place itself rejected the light, plunging her into the oppressive realization that there might be no way back. The man, slightly embarrassed, apologized for the fact that it was so dark, cold, and not very clean around, explaining that he had not invited anyone into his house for many years, because he simply did not have friends. But Littera only smiled softly and assured that this did not bother her at all. Knights in heavy armor, like silent guards of the night, stood near the stone walls. Their figures, shrouded in semi-darkness, seemed an integral part of this place, saturated with eternal winter, severity, and ancient secrets that mere mortals would be better off not touching. Finally, their journey came to an end, and, barely crossing the threshold of the majestic castle, Ferris confidently headed inside, without even turning around, knowing that his unexpected guest would still follow him, because she had made her choice and now had to face its consequences. The nobleman silently sat down on a heavy wooden chair near a massive table. His gaze was cold and focused. He clearly did not intend to waste time on long conversations, preferring to immediately get to the point, not giving Littera a chance to avoid the conversation for which she came here. Littera sat down carefully on the sofa next to him, but had barely managed to touch its surface when she shuddered in surprise, hearing a direct, almost emotionless question. Why did she suddenly want to marry him so persistently, knowing about his frightening reputation and harsh character? Narrowing her eyes sternly, she straightened up and said firmly, without a shadow of doubt in her voice, that her decision was conscious, and the only reason was that she wanted with all her heart to live in the north, accepting the cold, loneliness, and endless snowy expanses as her destiny. This place was far from the brilliant imperial palace, sparkling with gold, luxury, and wealth, like another world, where the destinies of great people were decided behind marble walls and intrigues were woven with thin threads of lies and betrayal. According to the plot of the book she found herself in, the life of the nobility was always accompanied by dangers. Corruption flourished everywhere, and behind every elegant back there were conspiracies, intrigues, and endless threats, turning even the most magnificent balls into a thinly disguised battlefield. Taking a small sip of hot tea while sitting on the sofa, Littera thought gloomily that it would probably be much easier to go through the university entrance exams again than to have a serious conversation with the Duke, whose cold presence only emphasized the absurdity of it all. Suddenly remembering her killer, the man who had once been her husband, she shuddered, feeling an unpleasant chill run down her skin, because he was not just a cruel man, but a madman, capable of grinding her into dust without the slightest regret for the sake of his obsession. Once, being naive, she truly believed that she could live a happy life with this man, but now even thoughts about him caused disgust, and the very idea of breathing the same air with him seemed unbearable, like a terrible nightmare from which it was impossible to wake up. Deciding not to pretend or create false illusions, Littera began to reason out loud with a slight smile, gently but confidently telling the Duke that her desire to be away from the imperial family was due to personal reasons that she was not yet ready to talk about. Ferris, without saying a word, only listened to her sullenly. His scarlet eyes remained indifferent, but in their depths there was something more hidden, as if he understood much more than he was going to voice. Bowing his head and looking away, Ferris said with a gloomy weariness in his voice that even if Littera was really ready to marry him, she would face more trouble than good, because life next to him was not a romantic fairy tale, but a severe test of strength. He calmly explained that the North is not just a land of cold and eternal snow, but a place where it is incredibly difficult for people from the South to survive, because it is home not only to fierce frosts, but also to monstrous creatures, monsters, dragons, and an icy cold that never goes away. Clenching his fingers in his lap as if collecting his thoughts, the Duke reluctantly added that the rumors about him had never been kind, because in the eyes of society he had always been something more than just a man. He was described as a beast, a wild aristocrat, a monster whose thirst for blood knew no bounds. He was described as a merciless monster, a bloodthirsty monster who knew no mercy, no compassion, no even simple human warmth. And as soon as someone met his gaze, fear penetrated to the very bones. Sitting opposite the girl, Ferris calmly but firmly added that even if their marriage remained just a formality, existing only on paper, it would still inevitably affect her reputation, because a lady who tied herself in bonds with a monster could never return. Remembering the letters from her past life, Littera realized that Ferris always underestimated himself, put others below him, as if he did not believe that he was worthy of anything more, and even when fate gave him a chance for happiness, he invariably refused it, as if resigned to his own role. The noblewoman lowered her gaze, not wanting to meet his piercing scarlet eyes, and with a slight sigh, she thought that even then, in her past life, when she tried to set the Duke up with someone else, he only coldly rejected each attempt, not allowing anyone to get close to him. Then Littera clutched her head in irritation, thinking that her stubborn friend would probably remain lonely if he didn't give himself at least the slightest chance for happiness, because even now, having met him face to face, she clearly saw that he did not consider himself worthy of love. Now that she had finally seen him in person, this stern but beautiful warrior, she realized that he just didn't want anyone to feel uncomfortable around him, because he was used to considering himself a monster who didn't deserve tenderness, devotion, or even love. Closing her eyes, Littera suddenly realized that even after so much time, Ferris remained the same, true to himself, still hiding his kind heart behind a mask of coldness and indifference that he himself had built, afraid that someone could destroy it. She always waited with trepidation for his letters, rereading them again and again, pressing them to her chest with a warm smile, as if in these lines she found that big world where a rude man allowed himself to be sincere. But now it seemed to her that this was not enough. Pursing her lips, young Littera firmly decided not to back down and insist on her choice, not to give him the opportunity to hide behind his fears again, not to let him again reject the opportunity to be with someone who truly cared about him. Ferris shuddered when he heard from the lady opposite that she, without hesitating for a moment, still intended to marry him. And in her voice there was no timid hope or doubt, but only firm determination, as if her choice was predetermined by fate itself. Folding her hands on her knees and giving her interlocutor a light but confident smile, Littera added that, on the contrary, she saw considerable benefit in this union, because being under the protection of the most powerful man in the North was not a privilege that should be thoughtlessly abandoned. Smiling a charming smile, the lady stated with a slight mockery that, with the terrifying monsters roaming around and the icy cold that permeated the air, her pursuers, who were members of the imperial family, would simply not be able to reach her here. For him, for the one chance to be near him, she walked through the cold without hesitation, among the trees that stood silent witnesses to the winter silence, their bare branches like frozen shadows clinging to the icy sky. But even this could not stop her. The charming beauty, filled with inner confidence, slowly closed her eyes, as if lost in thought for a moment, and then, gracefully lifting the corners of her lips, calmly said that, unfortunately, she simply had no other worthy proposal for her interlocutor. Ferris, stunned to the depths of his soul, opened his eyes wide, hardly comprehending the meaning of the words he had heard. For this noble woman not only wished to become his friend, but, what astonished him even more, expressed her intention of becoming his wife in the future, and he did not know how to react to this now. Littera, with the ease of those who are accustomed to think coolly, explained that if they had entered into a league of friendship, they would have avoided many of the inconveniences connected with the formalities imposed by society, and therefore would have been able to act freely. The aristocrat, clearly shocked by what he had heard, raised his head and, looking into her face, asked in bewilderment whether this noblewoman had really not noticed his ugly face, or whether she had deliberately ignored obvious flaws, putting something else first that he could not yet understand. Shrugging her shoulders with slight nonchalance, the beauty slowly brought her slender fingers to her face, thoughtfully sliding her gaze over her interlocutor, and then calmly said that of course his face could indeed seem frightening, but that was not the most important thing. She glanced at him attentively and asked him with a slight hint of curiosity what the aristocrat himself thought about the wedding, whether he was disgusted by the idea, whether he wanted to refuse, since all this could turn out to be much more unpleasant for him than she had assumed. Suddenly, as if appearing out of thin air, a whole scattering of letters materialized on the floor, sealed and tightly stacked on top of each other. Their number was so great that it seemed as if they had been carried by a sudden gust of wind, causing them to settle in chaotic disarray. Ferris, taking a deep breath, explained that, in fact, these letters were the reason he invited the lady here, because they contained something important, something that could change a lot, but he still doubted whether he should show them to her or whether it would be better to keep them a secret. Lytera stood frozen in mute shock, her gaze darting over the letters scattered before her, and, not believing her own eyes, she was momentarily speechless, and when asked if she knew where these mysterious messages came from, her fingers involuntarily clenched. She couldn't believe that these letters, which she thought had long since disappeared from this world, suddenly appeared in the hands of this guy, existing here and now, violating all her expectations. And so she stood silently, with a frowning face, barely aware that her mouth remained slightly open in amazement. That night, the palace was silent, broken only by the measured burning of the candles, when a servant, respectfully bowing his head, announced to the Duke that correspondence had arrived for him, and not just any mail, but letters sent from the imperial castle, which in itself was a rarity. To the master's words that he did not intend to receive them, the servant replied with a slight bow that the imperial family had shown particular persistence, expressing a firm desire to personally verify that their invitation would not go unanswered, and that the master would soon visit their palace. Ferris, smiling with a hint of disbelief, noted that this whole situation was more reminiscent of some kind of ridiculous performance, a joke played by the Empress herself, because she knew perfectly well that he could not leave the house. So what was the point of all this ostentatious politeness? The servant, with a slight bow of his head, asked what answer should be given to the lady. But the Duke, barely deigning to look at him, only lazily waved his hand and ordered him to compose an answer himself, and one that would leave no room for further persuasion and useless discussions. The door slammed shut with a soft click, and the room, filled with cool darkness, was left immersed in silence, and in the midst of this emptiness there was now only one person, a nobleman, sitting surrounded by the night, as if he himself had become a part of it, not wanting either the light or the presence of others. The warrior, feeling the weight of the day he had lived, slowly sank into the chair and, taking a deep breath, squeezed the armrests with his hands, as if hoping to hold on to something unchanging in this world, where he had long been haunted by fatigue, from which there was neither salvation nor peace. Closing his eyes, he slowly ran his hand over his face, then, sighing heavily, muttered with obvious irritation that he was already painfully bored with how everyone around him, without understanding the situation, began to bother him over trifles. Aristocrats were no worse than commoners in this. He had no desire to go to social balls, to participate in court intrigues, or to get involved in the struggle for the throne, where nobles danced. Refined conversations took place, webs of flattery and deceit were woven. Because he was not like that, he never considered this his world. Just when the boy was beginning to come to terms with the idea that he might never find someone he really wanted to talk to, fate seemed to decide to disprove his beliefs. Suddenly a blinding golden light poured out of a small box. Ferris, not hiding his surprise, turned sharply towards the strange glow, peering into the iridescent shine, and, frowning, quietly muttered a question, addressed more to himself. What the hell is this phenomenon? Where did this anomaly come from? And what could it mean? As he carefully approached and opened the box, he saw something he had never expected. Inside, as if it had appeared out of nowhere, there now lay a multitude of letters, sealed in thick envelopes, neatly folded as if they were waiting for their moment to finally be discovered. Litera, dumbfoundedly watching what was happening with obvious distrust, turned her gaze from Ferris to the box, then back to the letters and, unable to contain her confusion, asked a question that sounded absurd. Could all this really have appeared right in his chest of drawers by itself, without any explanation? Ferris, still a little stunned, nodded, confirming that everything had happened exactly as she had seen, after which the lady, feeling a little nervous, began to carefully sort through the messages, nervously touching the thick paper, as if trying to unravel the mystery of their sudden appearance. The noblewoman awkwardly grabbed her head, feeling a hot wave of realization wash over her. Could it be that all of this was not an accident, but a real gift from fate itself, its attempt to bring her closer to the Duke, to whom she felt affection? But suddenly her thoughts were interrupted by an unexpected touch. Someone's male hand gently lay on her shoulder, and a slightly hoarse but full of concern voice sounded nearby, asking with sincere concern if everything was okay with her and if she felt unwell. The warrior, who was not only taller than her but seemed to be a head taller than anyone she knew, said with unexpected gentleness that he did not want to disturb or worry her, realizing that after the long journey she probably already felt exhausted and needed rest. Litera, a little embarrassed by his attention, quickly cleared her throat into her hand and, trying to remain calm, assured him that she was completely fine. But she couldn't help but notice to herself how tall her interlocutor turned out to be, as if he had been created to tower over those around him. The man, turning away as if not wanting to meet her gaze, explained that he had no intention of making her uncomfortable, but only wanted to know one thing. Was she the same lady from the future who had once sent him all those letters that had now become a bridge between the past and the present? There really were too many letters, a whole scattering of envelopes scattered across the table. Their number was astounding, as if someone had been writing these messages for many years, not knowing whether they would ever reach the addressee. Litera hesitated for a moment, feeling doubt growing in her chest. Should she tell the truth and reveal everything she knew, or would it be better to lie, concealing the truth that could change the course of their conversation and perhaps her entire fate? The sunset stretched out beyond the windows, painting the ancient castle in crimson and golden hues, and its high towers, as if crowning the sky, shone in the last rays of the setting sun, creating a picture worthy of the most skilled artists. Standing by the window, Ferris thoughtfully gazed out at the blazing horizon, pondering the words of his guest, who, without flinching, admitted that she had come to him from the future. The very thought of this sounded so incredible that, had he been less cold-blooded, he might have considered it a stupid joke. Litera, clenching her hands into tight fists and resolutely raising her head, said with a slight smile that she could prove her case to him simply by predicting the events that would soon occur, but Ferris, not showing much interest, simply waved her off, saying that there was no need for that. It turned out that long before her appearance, he had passed on several strange letters to a priest, who, after careful examination, confirmed that the envelopes were indeed unusual, and their origin defied logical explanation. The high priest touched the sealed letters with reverent caution, and at that moment his eyes widened in amazement. A barely perceptible glow emanated from the envelopes, as if they contained ancient magic, incomprehensible to mere mortals. The priest, bowing low before the Duke, calmly but firmly stated that no further checks were required, since the letters that had appeared in such a mysterious way could not be an accident, but were a test that the nobleman had to pass in order to find the truth. Ferris thoughtfully lowered his gaze, directing it to the window behind which the day was slowly fading, and, watching this, he thought about the mysterious girl who wrote him these letters from the future, and although her image remained vague for him, every word written on paper seemed to bring them closer together. He had never seen her face, never heard her voice, but with each new letter this stranger named Litera became closer, as if her thoughts had overcome centuries, reaching him across distances, and he felt an invisible but strong connection with the one whose lines were imbued with warmth. She wrote to him not out of self-interest, not out of a desire to please, but simply as if they were old acquaintances, and her easy questions, simple but sincere, had no hidden meaning, but carried only a friendly interest that gave him a feeling of comfort that he had not known for many years. Sitting in his office, he reread the letters, not looking up from the thin envelopes, as if in fear of losing something important, because the lines that came from the distant future were more than just letters for him. They became a thread connecting him with someone close. The man's hand was tightly clutching a thin sheet of paper covered in elegant handwriting, and on it, right on the knuckles, an old scar was visible. And in the letter he was holding, the noblewoman was carefully and caringly asking him about his well-being, as if she really cared about how he was feeling. The Duke desperately wanted to meet the one who wrote him these touching messages, but he understood perfectly well that he could not leave his home and the lands of the north, because his duty to his family and people was more important to him than any personal desires, no matter how strong they were. Having carefully hidden the letters in the depths of the drawer, he firmly decided that he would not rush to answer. He needed time to think the situation over properly and only then make a final decision on how to deal with the mysterious stranger whose words penetrated his soul. The Duke's bedroom was spacious. There were no excesses in its decoration, but every detail spoke of the high status of the owner. A huge bed with heavy velvet bedspreads, columns in the corners, walls decorated with carvings, and a wide window with a breathtaking view. As Ferris was calmly throwing a long dressing gown over his shoulders, intending to finally go to rest after a long day, a servant entered the room silently, bowed respectfully, and bowing his head, announced that his lordship had received a new letter from a baroness. In a calm and unperturbed voice, reserved and even a little detached, the servant announced that the name of the mysterious aristocrat who had sent this enigmatic envelope was Litera, as if this name in itself carried with it a certain importance, weight, and unshakable confidence. Having barely heard such an unexpected name, the aristocrat, as if fearing that the letter might disappear from sight, quickly snatched it from the servant's hands, leaving him standing in complete confusion, with his palms absurdly raised up, as if he was still trying to hold a non-existent object in his fingers. Without wasting a second, without thinking or being distracted, Ferris immediately greedily stared at the lines of the letter that was in his hands, running his eyes from one word to another, trying to get to the heart of the mysterious stranger's message as quickly as possible. But as soon as his gaze lingered on the key words, the meaning of which suddenly pierced his consciousness, he froze in place, as if time had frozen around him, realizing that the mysterious aristocrat was offering him nothing less than a contract marriage, and real shock flashed in his eyes. Feeling a hot wave of embarrassment wash over him, Ferris looked away, then, hesitating a little, admitted to his interlocutor that it was not the marriage proposal itself that had shaken him to the depths of his soul, but the ease with which she had revealed to him the incredible secret. She had come to him from the future. After a short pause filled with tense silence, he turned to look her straight in the eye and added with a slight reproach in his voice that since she was destined to come from the future, then perhaps she should understand better than anyone how important it was to make rational decisions. The aristocrat only smiled softly at him in response. Her face lit up with a mysterious light, and her whole figure at that moment looked as if she had stepped off the canvas of a great artist. Her delicate skin shimmered with a porcelain shine, her eyes deep and shimmering like violets in the moonlight. There were only a few steps between them, but that space seemed to be filled with hundreds of unspoken thoughts and emotions. Their gazes met, and the barely noticeable movement forward made the distance between them almost imperceptible. Their feet were so close that they almost touched. The man, feeling slightly awkward but still overcoming his inner uncertainty, carefully extended his hand to her, as if inviting her into this fragile moment, into the unknown that awaited them both beyond the borders of this strange but fascinating acquaintance. As if carefully weighing every word, he looked into her eyes and finally, quietly but confidently, said that if she was truly confident in her choice and would never regret this decision, then he accepted her proposal and was ready to link his fate with hers by concluding a marriage between them. Over the past 5 years, she had sent him many letters, one after another, each filled with deep affection, anticipation, and something elusively personal that made her reread them again and again. But he had always remained reserved, postponing meetings. However, among all her letters, one turned out to be special. Unlike the others, unusual and even disturbing, and it was this one that was etched into his memory more than the others. That very last one, which differed from the others not only in tone, but also in that inevitable tragic shade. In this message, written just before her death, the noblewoman, as if saying goodbye, left him with a sincere, piercing hope that someday she would still be able to see her dear friend, even beyond the edge of life, in a world where there are no distances, prohibitions, or the impossible. It was then, clutching these last lines in his hands, that the stern northern warrior, accustomed to battle, finally learned of her death, and for the first time in many years, regret pierced his heart. Regret that all these years he had stubbornly refused to fulfill her one request for a meeting. Having read her heartfelt lines, which came through time from the distant future, he realized that he would no longer repeat his previous mistakes, and in this life he would no longer allow himself to refuse her any request, no matter how strange or unexpected her desire might be. Slowly extending his hand forward, the warrior remained motionless, as if frozen in anticipation of the inevitable answer, reservedly but intently watching her face, how emotions flickered in her eyes, how the slightest shadow of a smile appeared on her lips, capable of changing the course of their destinies. Littera did not hesitate for a moment. Her decision was firm, unshakable, born not on impulse, but long-lived in her heart. With a light, almost joyful laugh, she nodded, because more than anything in life she wanted to know what kind of person this mysterious Ferris was. And the next moment their palms closed, intertwining in a barely perceptible movement. Her thin, fragile hand, like a petal, lay in the strong, calloused palm of the warrior, bearing the traces of countless battles, but at that moment becoming incredibly gentle. Ferris, feeling the heat rising in his cheeks, turned away in embarrassment when the girl suddenly addressed him in a gentle, almost intimate tone, which he had not expected to hear, and then, having overcome his excitement, quietly replied that she was allowed to call him whatever she liked. However, when, in response to her warm treatment, he, with the equanimity inherent only to him, unexpectedly declared that he would call her older sister, the girl suddenly froze awkwardly, frozen in mute horror, realizing that he did not perceive her at all as a future spouse. Squeezing his hand a little tighter, she frowned, but did not remove her hand, but, on the contrary, with slight but obvious irritation, persistently asked him not to invent anything extra and simply call her by name, making it clear that she did not intend to tolerate such misunderstandings. On the massive oak table between them lay a parchment with the Duke's seal, an important document in which all the terms of their union were clearly spelled out, an official marriage contract, carefully thought out to the smallest detail, as if it were not a matter of feelings, but a dry deal. Without a moment's hesitation, the aristocrat resolutely took the pen, wrote her signature on the document, and thus officially became the nobleman's wife. After which, with a light exhalation, she carefully placed the pen back on the table, as if she had just sealed her fate with an inevitable oath. After the signature was put, the girl calmly turned to her newly made husband, reminding him that the wedding itself had no meaning for them. It was only a formal step, a simple exchange of signatures on official papers, without any obligations. The aristocrat involuntarily tensed up when he heard the following words of his companion. She added with ease that if a real lady of the heart ever appeared in his life, the only one for whom his heart would beat faster, then she would not object to the divorce. When the warrior asked whether she had a husband in her past life, the girl answered in the affirmative, but her tone remained reserved and her gaze was barely perceptibly distant, as if this fact did not have any special meaning for her or had long since lost its importance. But the next moment, her seriousness was replaced by a slight playfulness. Winking at her new husband, she smiled and, raising her thumb up, assured him that she would always support his choice and that he could be the first to share the news with her if he ever found true love. The nobleman's face remained grim and impassive, as if carved from stone, not flinching for a moment when an inappropriate joke was made, which he clearly did not appreciate, leaving it unnoticed as if it were just an insignificant noise not worth his reaction. The chandeliers under the high ornate ceiling cast light, highlighting the aristocratic bearing of the man whose voice sounded firm and peremptory, declaring that this marriage would not take place and that he would not look for another wife, as if the matter was closed forever. While Litera followed him without further ado, obeying his confident gait, Ferris, without slowing down, calmly and measuredly explained that soon he would introduce her to those whom she would see in the palace more often than others, because among the servants there were those with whom she would inevitably have to cross paths. They stopped in a small but cozy room, not far from two people whose conversation seemed animated, a butler with a posture developed by years of service, and a maid whose gestures betrayed emotionality, were clearly discussing something important and did not notice the guests. It was an older man with a cold, penetrating gaze, named Yugum, and Nyx, an adult maid with a collected look, both dressed in strict dark clothes, without unnecessary emotions, like the shadows of this palace, accustomed to discipline and restraint in every movement. Litera, without losing her friendliness, introduced herself with a slight but confident smile, trying to show herself worthy of her new role, because from now on she was not just a guest, but the mistress of this majestic palace, the wife of the Duke, and she had to win the respect of those who served within these walls. The servants barely exchanged glances before they began to whisper, but their expressions remained strangely gloomy, as if their restraint hid a question or an anxious premonition that they could not allow themselves to voice out loud in the presence of their new mistress. Suddenly, before anyone could break the tense silence, the man standing next to the lady took a firm step forward, his decisive movement emphasizing his confidence, and now they stood shoulder to shoulder, as if ready to meet something important or inevitable. And, as if by agreement, the servants declared in one voice that they categorically did not approve of their master's marriage to this woman. Their words sounded cold, alienated, without a hint of respect or cordiality, as if her appearance in itself was an unwanted threat to this house. Ferris and Litera froze in amazement, their eyes met, full of incomprehension, because they could not imagine that their union would be met with such sharp rejection, as if behind these words there was not just personal hostility, but something deeper, hidden from their eyes. Yugum, without flinching or softening his tone, confidently explained that he personally did not approve of this marriage and that it would be wiser for the girl to turn back to the south where she came from, for their cold north was no place for her, and no titles or bonds of marriage would change that opinion. The noblewoman could not believe what was happening. Her lips parted in surprise. Her heart began to beat faster. Were these people really trying to throw her out of the house that was supposed to become her new refuge? Were they really going to reject her without the slightest chance? Ferris did not hesitate to take his lady's side. His gaze became cold, and his voice sounded firm and peremptory as he sternly reprimanded the servants for their insolence in daring to utter such words in the presence of the Duchess, the one who was now to become the mistress of this house. His face was distorted with anger, acquiring cruel, almost frightening features, and in his eyes there flashed a sinister rage, similar to that of a bloodthirsty warrior ready to tear apart an enemy, because he always despised such rudeness and disloyalty, and now he was not going to tolerate it in his house. However, Yugum, despite his master's anger, remained grim and unyielding, and looking him straight in the eye, calmly but firmly declared that this marriage was a foolish waste for both. Such an innocent girl did not deserve to live with such a cruel master as he believed Ferris to be. The couple froze in amazement, because none of them expected that the servants would act not for their master, but on the side of the Duchess, as if wanting to protect her from the man to whom she rightfully belonged, as if they saw her not as a wife, but as a victim in need of salvation. Yugum did not hide his disappointment. His face seemed stern and condemning, because in his opinion, the master had acted meanly, luring the young lady into the walls of their gloomy castle by deception, depriving her of a choice. And now he was going to tie her fate to himself, not caring about the consequences. The maid suddenly grabbed Litera by the hands, her voice trembling with tension as she quickly promised that if necessary, she would help her escape, save her from this place, because it would be better that way, which caused Litera to suddenly feel a wave of amazement. She even involuntarily recoiled. Ferris scowled at the maid, his lips twitching in the shadows and a shadow of annoyance crossing his face before he dismissed her words as silly fears, firmly declaring that all this worry was nonsense, a trivial whim that made no sense, and there was simply nothing to worry about. Litera, feeling uneasy about the tension, shrugged her shoulders timidly, then remarked in a soft, conciliatory voice that there had obviously been some misunderstanding, while the Duke, exhaling wearily, covered his face with his hand, as if he did not know how else to express his irritation. The servants froze in shock, unable to hide their surprise, when they heard the young lady, with warmth and tenderness in her voice, address their master by his last name, as if he were a close person, and not the formidable and distant ruler they knew. The lady stood straight, her posture remained proud, and her hands were folded in front of her, buried in soft, warm gloves, as if even this gesture spoke of her restraint and inner dignity, despite the tense atmosphere that reigned around her. With a light but confident movement, Litera waved her hand in front of her, and then, without flinching for a moment, firmly and clearly declared that she was not going to return to the south because she herself, of her own free will, had come to the cold castle, desiring marriage with their cruel but so attractive duke. Ferris flared up as if he was completely engulfed in flames. His face was flushed with a deep blush, betraying shock and embarrassment at the same time, and his gaze darted around in search of at least some kind of answer, because he clearly did not expect such a frank confession in front of the servants. Embarrassed to the depths of his soul, he asked Litera to behave more modestly, fearing that the servant would understand his words completely differently than they should have, to which she only calmly shrugged her shoulders, looking at him with a smile, and calmly replied that she simply told the truth, not seeing anything reprehensible in it. The servants gradually calmed down, although they were still shocked that their formidable master had been proposed to, since usually people not only avoided approaching him, but were even afraid to meet his gaze, fearing to provoke his anger or displeasure. Having moved away to a respectful distance, the maid and butler, realizing their haste, bowed before their masters, apologizing for the misunderstanding, for allowing themselves to jump to hasty conclusions and misinterpreting the situation, casting doubt on the intentions of the new mistress. However, despite their remorse, a shadow of cautious mistrust could still be seen in their gazes, but at the same time, a timid, almost tremulous joy for the owner, because it seemed he had really found his other half, a woman who not only was not afraid of him, but was also ready to link her fate with him. The wood crackled in the fireplace. The fire lazily licked its surface, casting strange reflections of light on the walls, as if reflecting that barely perceptible but warm spark of hope that was born in this cold castle, along with an unexpected union. The man stood next to the noblewoman, who carefully sat down on the soft sofa. Her movements were smooth, but there was a slight stiffness in them, and therefore, fearing that the cold had gripped her thin shoulders, he silently covered her with a warm cape, carefully leaning closer to find out how she was feeling. When the conversation turned to the fact that the servants were actually happy for him to see that he had finally found love, Ferris let out a tired sigh and, with a barely noticeable sadness in his voice, replied that Litera herself seemed to see him more as a friend than a man she could call a husband. The beauty, slightly blushing, rubbed her neck awkwardly, admitting that he was right, that this was exactly what she had thought because, despite all his severity, in her eyes he remained, first of all, a man whom she respected, but perhaps did not love as much as she should have. When she, wanting to soften the moment, began to talk about what a kind and worthy person he was, Ferris suddenly interrupted her. His voice became firmer as he suddenly asked her a direct, almost cold question. Why did she die in her past life? The noblewoman froze, as if she had suddenly encountered an invisible barrier. Her lips trembled slightly, but she was in no hurry to answer, avoiding the topic, while the warrior, without taking his eyes off her, continued to speak, admitting that he would never want to condemn her to a love that could become a burden for her. Clasping her hands in front of her, Litera said quietly, but with obvious determination, that after everything that had happened with her previous husband, the fear of finding new love had firmly settled in her heart, like a shadow that could not be shaken off, no matter how much she wanted it. Once upon a time, she and the charming prince were happy. Their union began as a beautiful story filled with tenderness and dreams, where they were a loving couple, surrounded by the admiration of the court and hopes for a bright future. But over time, everything changed. Her husband turned into a cruel tyrant, whose love was more like shackles. His possessiveness became unbearable. He craved complete submission, demanded that her gaze belong only to him, that no one but him be reflected in her eyes. The young noblewoman, as if casting aside these heavy memories, slowly rose to her feet, her bare feet slipping into soft house slippers, but even this inconspicuous gesture seemed full of dignity and determination in her performance. She walked confidently towards the Duke. Her steps were light, but there was an unwavering firmness in them, as if each step confirmed her determination. Ferris, without realizing it, stepped back slightly, as if her approach had disturbed his usual calm. Ferris was struck by such a frank confession and finally realized that it was probably because of this past experience that Litera continued to suffer, hiding behind a smile the fear of being trapped again in a love that, instead of happiness, brings only pain. Crossing her arms over the back of her chair, Litera nodded calmly, agreeing that she had always sincerely wanted him, her friend, to find happiness. But that was precisely why she was afraid to burden him with herself, fearing that her feelings could become a hindrance to him rather than a blessing. Raising his hands in front of him, as if trying to give his words even more persuasiveness, the warrior firmly and without hesitation said that what had happened was not her fault, that the past, no matter how difficult it was, did not depend on her actions and certainly should not become her burden. Litera, closing her eyes with a tired voice, said that she always hated the stereotypes that surrounded her husband, because behind the mask of severity and composure hid a man who was not only a reliable companion, but also a kind, loyal friend to whom she could trust her heart. A soft, warm gleam flashed in her eyes, and when she leaned her elbow on the table and supported her head with her hand, with a slight smile she said that they would definitely find the one and only one for him who could become his true other half. Her voice sounded sincere and inspired. Ferris took a deep breath, pinching the bridge of his nose before repeating with a small grin that with this approach he would most likely never find a lover. And to be honest, now that Litera was by his side, he wasn't sure he needed anyone else at all. Gently, carefully, as if afraid to frighten this moment, he took her gentle hands in his own, rough, calloused, crossed with thin white scars, traces of past battles and trials that he had to go through. Then, without unclasping his fingers, he dropped to one knee before the lady, his voice calm but firm, as he reminded her that he had once made a promise to always be there, in sorrow and in joy, in light and in darkness, and now, having become her husband, he would not back down from that oath. Ferris spoke these words without hesitation, with the same determination that made him not just a warrior, but a protector. The great warrior promised that he would always stand by her side, protecting her from any danger, be it enemies, conspiracies, or even her own fears. And yet, once, in a past life, when she still bore the title of Empress, a rebellion arose against her. Then Ferris had a chance to betray her, to turn away, to side with the rebels and gain power that might have changed his destiny, but he did not. But instead of engaging in a brutal fight, he made a choice that would forever change the course of events. By sending her a message warning of the coming rebellion, he not only betrayed those he served, but also fearlessly stood by her side, making this choice consciously. His sword, once as sharp as fate itself, was no longer directed against her, but served as a weapon against their common enemy, and the cold blade, covered with fine scratches, like a map of past battles, reflected the light with a last glimmer of hope for the coming liberation. The man, without a moment's hesitation, dropped to one knee before her, his gaze full of determination, and every gesture indicating that this act was not forced, but dictated by a sincere devotion that he swore to keep until the end of his days. He raised his head, looking into her face from the bottom up, and in his eyes there was an unwavering loyalty, because from now on he was ready to follow her orders unconditionally, recognizing in her not just the new empress, but also a dear friend to his heart, to whom he entrusted his fate. And now, as before, he again demonstrated his boundless devotion to her, dropping down on one knee next to her, and, with a trembling voice, uttering words full of sincerity that he did not want to see anyone next to him in the role of wife except her, because his heart belonged only to her. Ferris closed his eyes and sighed heavily, as if freeing himself from an invisible burden, and calmly said that all of these were just his whims, his weaknesses and caprices, and therefore she did not owe him anything, was not obliged to reciprocate, because love knows neither duty nor calculation. No longer able to contain her emotions, Littera suddenly stepped forward and forcefully grabbed her friend into a tight embrace, not giving him a chance to dodge, and he, caught by this unexpected impulse, froze in place, unable to believe what was happening. Ferris, accustomed to self-control, suddenly felt a warm wave of embarrassment spread throughout his entire body. His cheeks instantly flared with a bright blush, betraying the sincere surprise that had seized him, because he had not expected such a manifestation of feelings. Her thin but strong hands clenched even tighter on the fabric of his shirt, as if trying to hold on to the moment, not to let it disappear like a dream filled with warmth and tenderness that she was afraid to lose, but at the same time did not dare to fully express in words. Littera, not intending to break the strong embrace, only pressed herself closer to him and, raising her head, said in a firm but warm voice that more than anything in the world she wanted to see him happy, because his joy and peace were more important to her than any other feelings that lived in her heart. The warrior, accustomed to battles but not to such words, felt a blush instantly flare up on his cheeks, and the embarrassment that gripped his thoughts did not allow him to immediately find the right answer, because he did not expect to hear anything like that from her at that moment. His calloused, scarred hands hesitantly found their way to her waist, tentatively touching the light fabric of her dress, but he still didn't know whether he should fully embrace her in return or allow himself to believe that this touch alone spoke volumes about how he felt. Finally, overcoming the last of his doubts, the husband carefully embraced his newly made wife, holding her tightly to himself, as if he was afraid that this moment could dissolve in the cold air, and in every movement one could feel the tenderness, romance, and boundless love that filled his heart. A snowstorm raged outside the windows. The harsh climate gripped the palace with its icy breath, and it seemed that the cold days would last forever, while endless snowflakes swirled in the air, covering the world with a silent white blanket, hiding even the warmest memories under it. When night came, Littera, comfortably settled in bed, suddenly felt a slight shiver run through her body, because, to her surprise, even under the warm blanket it was chilly, and she could not understand why she had not foreseen this in advance, hoping that the nights here would be warmer. Ferris, accustomed to the cold, seemed not to feel the cold at all. He dozed peacefully on a small sofa, casually tucking his legs under him. His breathing was even, and his face was serene, as if the harsh winter outside the palace walls had no power over him. He had previously agreed without hesitation that it would be awkward to sleep next to her on their wedding night, and so, without even discussing it, he gave up his bed to his wife, choosing a less comfortable place for himself, because it was more important to him that she felt safe and comfortable. Shivering from the cold, Littera dreamed of only one thing, to get a heater or find at least some warmth that could drive away the piercing cold that made her shrink into a ball. But alas, all around was only the icy breath of the northern winter, which knew no mercy. Suddenly, in the silence, an unfamiliar voice rang out, soft but deep, and before she could even recognize its source, someone's warm hand carefully extended a thick black fur to her, and a moment later she realized that it was her husband, watching her with hidden concern. Ferris, without saying anything extra, with a slight smile covered her shoulders with a warm cape, simply explaining that he heard how she was shivering from the cold and therefore could not stay away, because it was important for him that she felt comfortable in this harsh land. Looking down, Littera admitted, slightly upset, that it was not the cold that was to blame, but her lack of preparation, because she was simply not used to such a climate, where winter reigns mercilessly, leaving no chance even to those who tried to resist its chilling touch. And so, until Ferris found a way to finally solve the heating problem, he did the only thing he could at that moment. He wrapped his wife tightly in a warm fur blanket, trying to give her at least a drop of comfort in the snowy cold that enveloped their new home. With a gentle smile, sweet Littera thanked her husband for his care, sincerely appreciating his attention, but despite everything, the cold still penetrated her to the bone, and, a little embarrassed, she confessed this to him, hoping that he would not condemn her for such weakness. Without thinking for long, she took off her cape, carefully folded it next to her, then sat down on the bed and, looking up at her husband, quietly but confidently asked him to stay next to her, share the bed with her and help her warm up, because his warmth was her only salvation. The room was immersed in a soft, semi-darkness, and outside the window, in the weak light of the moon, snowflakes fell silently, enveloping the palace in a white blanket. Silence reigned all around, and the rich, majestic bedroom with a massive bed by the window looked like a picture from a distant fairy tale. Ferris, flushed with embarrassment, embraced his wife with some hesitation, pressing her carefully to himself, feeling how cold her body was, and, worried about her, quietly asked if she had become a little warmer, if she was no longer experiencing discomfort. With blissful relief, Littera closed her eyes and whispered with a slight smile that she was now finally warm, feeling safe, and that, thanks to his care, she would no longer freeze tonight and would certainly not die of hypothermia in this harsh climate. The only thing the beauty did complain about was her husband's massive, strong arms, which, without wanting to, almost strangled her in a tight embrace, preventing her from breathing freely, and the man, slightly embarrassed, awkwardly said that, alas, he could not do anything about it. Indeed, his build was imposing. His strong warrior figure seemed enormous in comparison to her petite, fragile body, as if there was a giant next to her whose strength could crush walls, but there was still a sense of caution in his touch. To herself, Littera, looking at her husband with a slight smile, involuntarily compared him to a huge polar bear, just as big, warm, and a little clumsy in his gentle attempts not to harm, and this thought evoked a strange but pleasant feeling in her soul. Without even noticing how it happened, she gradually began to sink into a sweet slumber. Her eyelids became heavy, her breathing evened out, and before she realized it, she was already fast asleep, covered in the warmth of his embrace, as if under reliable protection. Outside the window, the endless starry sky stretched out, its depth beckoning into its mysterious peace. The night was silent, and only the flickering lights on the black velvet reminded that somewhere out there, far away, life goes on, not subject to human worries. Once upon a time, when he was still a teenager, Ferris lost his father and realized that from now on he was destined to always be alone, because fate deprived him not only of parental love, but also of a sense of security, and therefore, having become a young duke, he took upon himself the heavy burden of loneliness. As they parted, the father, in a weakening voice, whispered to his son the last words of instruction, filled with the weight of the years lived and bitter wisdom, that he should not trust anyone, because the world is cruel, and betrayal can come even from where you least expect it. And Ferris forever remembered these words, deeply engraved in his consciousness, and from that very day until now he followed them unswervingly, fencing himself off from the world, drowning in dark thoughts, not allowing anyone to penetrate his heart, which had long been accustomed to loneliness. But then Littera appeared, and from the very first day she did not try to break down his walls, but was simply there, sincere, kind, caring, giving warm smiles that he had not seen for so long, and despite his coldness, she sincerely wanted to connect her life with him. Returning to his destiny, this woman suddenly simply hugged him, giving him warmth that he had not known since childhood, and at that moment he, stunned, froze, not understanding what to do, because in his soul emotions were seething that he had never encountered before. But suddenly, Littera began to move anxiously in his arms. Her breathing became ragged, and her thin fingers clenched into weak fists, and then Ferris realized that she was seeing a nightmare that captivated her mind even in her sleep, and without thinking, he carefully squeezed her palm, trying to bring her back to reality. Ferris watched his wife closely as she tossed and turned in her sleep. Her breathing became intermittent, and from her parted lips came plaintive, barely audible words. She did not want to die, as if she was reliving the terrible events of the past. Abito Leibes Latum, that was the name of the crown prince, whose image was carved into her memory in bloody strokes, golden hair, scarlet eyes like flames, a treacherous smile. He was the one who destroyed her life, the one who forced her to flee north, escaping her inevitable death. It was the fear of him that had pushed her down this path, forcing her to leave everything behind, to seek refuge in a cold land, hoping that she would be safe there, that he would never find her again, and would never be able to raise his merciless hand over her again. Ferris, looking at her thoughtfully, had already made a final decision for himself. From now on, he would watch every step of the prince, waiting for the slightest threat, and if he dared to come closer, he would not allow him to even look in the direction of Littera, guarding her peace. Noticing how her teeth were clenched too tightly, as if she was trying to suppress a scream or pain, he carefully touched her lips with warm fingers, gently pushing them apart, not allowing herself to be harmed, and whispered her name, hoping to tear her from the clutches of the nightmare. Ferris, without thinking, carefully placed his knuckles between her teeth, allowing her to bite them but not to hurt herself, because it was better for her to hurt him than to hurt herself, and in this gesture there was his quiet but deep concern, which he did not even think to speak out loud. So, lying in the darkness of the bedroom, the man closed his eyes and mentally turned to the gods, praying to them for only one thing, that his wife's sleep would be peaceful tonight, that the horror that haunted her in nightmares would finally leave her alone, allowing her to rest and gain strength. And in the morning, when the first rays of the sun broke through the thick curtains, Littera, still embarrassed, folded her palms in front of her in a guilty gesture and, lowering her gaze, sincerely asked her husband for forgiveness for having bitten him in her sleep without realizing it. Raising his hand, Ferris gently tried to convince his wife that she was not guilty of anything, that everything was fine, because in a dream a person cannot control his actions, and he did not at all consider her actions to be something deserving of an apology. As an argument, the man recalled with a slight grin how he was used to sleeping in difficult conditions, experiencing cold nights in the wild forests where hungry wolves howled around him, and the ground beneath him was covered with ice, so that a slight bite in his sleep was a mere trifle compared to what he went through. Covering her face with her hand, Littera exhaled heavily, clearly feeling awkward, and closing her eyes, guiltily muttered that next time she would simply clench her handkerchief with her teeth to avoid something like this, because in her opinion it would be better for both of them. After these words, she suddenly stepped closer, alarmed, speaking quickly, filled with anxiety, explaining that she had in no way meant to inconvenience him and hoped that she had not caused him too much pain. And then, as soon as he reminded her of her own words about minor troubles and slight discomfort in friendly relations being completely normal, Littera herself shuddered, realizing that he had simply used her own logic against her. When, with a slight smile, she ironically noted that perhaps he would even give her all his money and mansion, Ferris, instead of laughing, thought about it, taking her words literally, and it seemed, for a moment began to seriously consider such a possibility. After a short pause, he suddenly leaned closer, looking intently into her eyes, and with unexpected confidence said that he intended to make a magnificent duchess out of her, to which Littera snorted, frowned, and with obvious displeasure declared that this was the last thing she wanted. Littera flushed with irritation, her eyes flashed with anger, and without holding back her emotions, she grabbed her husband by the strong shoulders, began to shake him angrily from side to side, as if trying to shake the naivety out of him, indignantly exclaiming that he was mistaken. The door remained closed, hiding what was happening inside, and a deep, almost tangible silence reigned in the room, broken only by the barely audible breathing of two people frozen in motionlessness, as if time had stopped for a moment, not daring to disturb their solitude. Then, like a splash on a still surface of water, the door slowly opened and a servant appeared in the doorway, bowing his head respectfully before politely but with a note of caution in his voice, asking if he could come in, since it was morning and his master had to go down to breakfast. However, as soon as he looked inside, a very interesting picture appeared before his eyes. A young couple found themselves in an awkward position. Litera, without realizing it, was sitting on top of her husband, her arms still wrapped around him, and their eyes met in confusion. For a moment, there was absolute silence in the room. No one moved, no one made a sound, as if even the air had frozen, and the servant standing in the doorway also froze, silently watching the loving couple, clearly not knowing what to do in such a situation. After this, the butler, realizing the awkwardness of the moment, hastily closed the door, apologizing for the sudden intrusion, and embarrassedly muttering that he had not at all wanted to distract them from the performance of their marital duties, after which he disappeared into the corridor, leaving behind a light rustle of footsteps. Left alone, the husband and wife looked at each other and, realizing the absurdity of the situation, agreed that their servant had obviously misunderstood what he had seen, while in fact they had only been playfully arguing, meaning nothing reprehensible. Yugam, standing below, coughed guiltily when his colleague, the stern maid, with her arms crossed disapprovingly over her chest, reminded him that she had warned him more than once not to burst into the master's quarters without knocking properly, if he did not want to find himself in an awkward position again. Meanwhile, breakfast was served in the dining room. Golden fried eggs, fresh salad with crispy leaves, delicious slices of bacon were displayed on the massive table, and silver cutlery, a fork, a knife, a spoon, was neatly laid out nearby. Having brought a delicious piece of fried meat to her mouth, Litera glanced at her husband and, putting her fork aside, leaned slightly towards him, asking if he could do her one small favor, since he was nearby and seemed to be in a good mood. To his interested question about what exactly she needed, the girl waved her hand to the side with a slight movement and, as if talking about something insignificant, casually answered that she would like to occupy his office for a while, just for a couple of hours. The adult nobleman, without thinking for long, nodded in agreement, but still with slight curiosity, asked why his wife needed his personal workplace and for what purpose she suddenly decided to spend time there, since she had previously shown no interest in it. There were a lot of papers on the table, as if they had accumulated over many months of work. They were all laid out in a disorderly manner, creating a feeling of chaos and disorganization. It was difficult to find anything important among them. Everything was lost in this paper mess. The answer was simple, and without further explanation. Litera wanted to earn a little money, and for this she was ready to sort out the cases that had accumulated on her desk. A light rustling of paper was heard when she began to sort through the documents, carefully laying them out in the right order so as not to miss anything important. Having carefully laid out the stacks of papers in front of her, Litera carefully ran her gaze over the documents, mentally assessing the upcoming amount of work, and realizing how tiring it could be, she sighed barely noticeably because she had no time to take a break. However, working in her husband's office turned out to be not such a bad decision. The atmosphere here was very comfortable. The furniture was of good quality and elegance, and the soft, richly decorated sofa and massive desk gave the room a special coziness. For a moment, she allowed herself to be distracted, imagining Ferris, sitting at this very table, writing even lines on paper, writing her letters, perhaps thinking of her in moments of silence, and this thought brought a slight, barely perceptible smile to her lips. With a light, almost imperceptible movement, Litera ran her palm over the smooth, cool surface of the tabletop, feeling under her fingers the quality of the expensive wood, its impeccably polished texture. The office was truly comfortable, and the furniture was created for comfort. The rustling of thin paper was the only sound that filled the room as the pages turned smoothly, sliding one after another as if a gentle breeze were playing with them, carrying time and thoughts away with it, while the dim candlelight cast strange shadows across the antique table. The heroine leaned over a stack of documents, carefully reading each line in search of mistakes, when her gaze suddenly caught on something strange. Details that seemed insignificant suddenly came together to form a puzzle, awakening genuine interest in her. The graceful lady carefully lifted the sheet of thin, slightly yellowed paper, bringing it closer to her face to examine the details, and suddenly her eyes widened in amazement, her lips involuntarily parted, and her gaze, calm just a second ago, became attentive and wary. Her fingers convulsively squeezed the paper, as if holding something valuable and dangerous at the same time, and then she called out in a firm voice to the servant, who instantly approached, bowed his head in a respectful bow, put his hand to his chest, and a slight excitement could be seen in his gaze. The lady ordered the adult servant to immediately take her to her husband, because the need to show him something important could not tolerate delay, and her voice sounded so confident that those around her had no doubt about the urgency of her request. Ahead of him stood a massive door leading to the armory, securely locked as if protecting its contents from prying eyes, but inside was Ferris, who was carefully examining the weapons, checking their balance, sharpness, and strength, as if preparing for an important battle. The loyal and devoted servant knocked carefully on the heavy door before entering, respectfully inquiring of the master about his presence and possible desire to receive a visitor, trying not to disturb his work unnecessarily. Expectations were met. Ferris was indeed inside, his bare shoulders covered with crisscrossing scars left by past battles, and his tense muscles betrayed the recent training in which he had once again tested his body for strength. The man turned to face his wife, greeting her with a confident stance, his battle-scarred body telling the story of the battles he had endured, his powerful muscles betraying strength and endurance, and every movement with the polished grace of a warrior. Frozen in slight embarrassment in front of her husband, who stood before her with a naked torso, the lovely lady lowered her gaze and with a hint of awkwardness asked where his clothes had disappeared, as if trying to find an explanation for such an unexpected sight. Ferris calmly picked up the sweater that had a large hole in it and casually pointed out the damage, explaining that he was just checking the degree of wear on the fabric after the last workout, without attaching any particular importance to it. The warrior looked away for a moment, then bowed his head with slight embarrassment, allowing a long strand of hair to fall over his face, and quietly asked his wife if he really looked so inappropriate that it caused her such obvious confusion. Raising her hand in front of her, Lytera said with slight indignation, but still with a hint of concern in her voice, that everything was completely fine with him and there was nothing to worry about, although deep down she was still confused by this unexpected situation. After these words, she cleared her throat slightly, gracefully covering her lips with her hand, and, looking away, said that she also had something important that she would like to show him, as if trying to give her words more confidence than she actually felt. Ferris slowly began to pull his shirt over himself. His movements were measured, as if he did not attach any particular importance to this scene, but a barely noticeable smile slipped into the corners of his lips when he caught a slight uncertainty in his wife's voice. The man's hand confidently clutched the document related to land ownership, his fingers firmly holding the fragile sheet, while his eyes carefully slid along the lines, trying to catch the essence of a possible mistake or a trick that could be hidden behind the official wording. A quiet voice, barely audible even in the silence of the room, reached his ear as Lytera gently explained that the matter before him concerned the very land he had long wanted to purchase, but circumstances had prevented him from completing the transaction as he had originally planned. Previously, the Duke had approached the Empress more than once, sending carefully crafted letters in which he detailed his desire to expand his holdings and obtain at his disposal the lands that seemed to him the most profitable and strategically important. Now, sweet Lytera, smiling slightly, calmly explained that she had decided to take the initiative into her own hands and buy these lands for him, since there was no longer a single obstacle that could prevent the fulfillment of his long-standing desire. Upon hearing this stunning news, the man stood frozen in complete stupor, unable to comprehend that on the very lands they were being offered to purchase, there was a diamond mine, and if they decided to buy it, they would become the owners of untold riches. Without a second's hesitation, seized by sudden excitement, Ferris takes off and, shouting on the go that they absolutely must immediately go and acquire that territory, rushes to his wife. But she, noticing his excited state, is forced to take the initiative and begin to calm him down. The nobleman clutched his head and was in deep shock, unable to believe that this lady, with whom he was talking, was so easily and naturally ready to transfer to him the ownership of lands, in the depths of which treasures were hidden in the form of a gold mine, capable of bringing incredible wealth. And suddenly, breaking the tense silence that hung in the air, the noblewoman spoke softly, but at the same time decisively addressing her husband, calling him by name as if wishing to emphasize the importance of the moment and attract his full attention to her words. Her voice sounded stern, almost commanding, when she asked her husband with genuine seriousness whether he really intended to refuse her gift, so generous, as if testing his resolve and wanting to understand to what extent he was capable of accepting such a magnanimous offer. And this man had no choice but to accept his wife's proposal, because he knew that to refuse her would not only mean offending her, but also causing doubt in his determination and love, and she was so happy that her eyes sparkled like stars in the night sky. Yugum, who had been standing to the side the entire time, watched the proceedings with concern, feeling awkward as his gaze involuntarily slid over the young gentleman, as if he were looking for some justification for his silent presence in this situation. The blade struck down the monsters that threatened their world with such terrible force and incredible precision that not a single monster had time to even make a sound before its body was swallowed by the earth, and its blood, merging with the white snow, spread out, forming ominous and frightening patterns. The army of young men stood in a strong line, their blades held ready, their hearts beating in unison, and, exchanging brief but confident glances, they were about to go to the Duke to inform him of the success of their hunt. But they were afraid to approach their general because today he was in an unusual mood, angry and gloomy, like a real demon, ready to destroy their doubts with just one look, and no one dared to disturb the alarming silence that reigned around him. The Duke's face was so menacing that it seemed he was ready to bare his fangs, his beard was sticking out, and his eyes were absolutely white with anger, as if his rage itself was ready to consume everything around him, and no one dared to look him in the face. Litera was lying on the sofa, happily reading a book, immersed in its pages, when suddenly her interlocutor turned to her, saying that he wanted to pay her for her work and show gratitude for everything she had done to ease his situation. Her handsome husband sat next to her in a soft chair, and noticing her concentration, asked what she would like to receive from him as gratitude for her help with the diamond mine, clearly hoping that she would not ask too much in exchange for such a generous gift. The nobleman was deeply confused and saddened to hear from the lady that she really did not need anything, because her help was sincere and she did not expect a reward, which only increased his feeling of dissatisfaction and anxiety from their conversation. Every time the man approached his wife, he told her that she did not need any help from him, because she herself copes with any business perfectly well, earns money herself, buys herself dresses, jewelry, and everything she needs without asking anything from him. The girl never asked him for gifts or money because she was independent, self-sufficient, and, despite this, always pleased him with her hard work, independence, and taste, which, of course, delighted the man. And despite her independence, the man increasingly felt the desire to show his care and tenderness to her because, despite her strong and independent character, he wanted her to feel her value and his love in her every step and movement. And then one day, unable to restrain himself, he grabbed her hands, looked into her eyes, and, filled with sincere feeling and trepidation, told her directly that he was now ready to give her gifts that, as he hoped, would make her even happier, and let this be his small contribution to her life. But Litera, smiling and with a slight expression of confidence, insisted that her husband had already done enough for her in her past life, and that she needed nothing more, since she was satisfied with all the gifts he had already given her. Ferris, shocked by her words, knelt down to the side, overcome with a deep feeling of melancholy, because his beloved, sitting next to him, with unperturbed calmness continued to drink tea, not paying attention to his feelings and refusing his offers and attention. In his past life, he had given her many jewels, exquisite boxes, money, and other valuables, which he thought would demonstrate his love and affection, but it turned out that this was not enough to satisfy her. The Grand Duke even gave her a private house for various types of recreation, in addition to all the various riches that he generously presented, trying to surround her with everything that one could only dream of, hoping that this would bring her long-awaited happiness and satisfaction. However, despite all these generous gifts, Litera was deeply disappointed when, in response to her words, Ferris wrote to her that he wanted absolutely nothing from her, and that his love was sincere, without the desire to receive anything in return. Now that their roles had changed, the Duke was full of anger and disappointment, while the lady, with a smile and complete calm, continued to laugh, giving him gifts, showing how much she could offer him without expecting anything in return. With a heavy sigh, the lovely Litera thought about how, despite all her desires, she could not ask her husband for anything, because her conscience did not allow her to take advantage of his generosity and care, even if it were so necessary. Suddenly, the Duke, with a firm determination in his voice, turned to his wife, attracted her attention, and declared that he had never retreated on the battlefield, always fought to the last, and therefore he had no intention of leaving her now, when they were sharing this important moment together. However, before he could finish speaking, the doors suddenly burst open and one of the nobleman's subordinates ran into the room, bringing shocking news that instantly cooled the atmosphere. Their lands were being attacked by monsters, the threat of which was unprecedented. A young couple, shocked by the terrible news, froze in shock when they learned that their lands were attacked by terrible monsters, posing a terrible threat that completely absorbed their attention, forcing them to forget about all personal experiences and fears. Ferris sat on the dead animal, his face clouded with heavy breathing and his eyes full of pain and disappointment. Everything that seemed like such a sweet moment with his wife was suddenly destroyed, like a fragile glass vessel, spoiled by terrible news. His face was stained with blood, and his eyes reflected a deep sadness, symbolizing the hopelessness he faced, as what had recently brought him joy and comfort was now only a painful reminder of lost hope. His lovely wife, with her beautiful pink hair and blue dress, admitted with a sincere smile that she was simply happy to be with the Duke, despite everything that was happening, but Ferris, deep down, wanted to make her even happier. The Duke clutched his head, feeling helpless, bowing it in hopeless despair, his posture full of devastation, and the snow, falling silently from the sky, mixed with the blood that covered his body, as if to symbolize that their world would never be the same again. The upset subordinates noticed how their master's mood was getting worse and worse, and full of fear to approach him, they watched him with caution, not daring to disturb the silence of his anger, which was becoming more and more heavy and impenetrable. Rising to his feet, the Duke resolutely declared to his soldiers that all that was left was to carry out the final cleansing of the monsters, for the sooner they accomplished the task, the sooner he could return home to his wife, whom he missed so much. The aristocrat, with determination and a loud voice, gave orders to the 2nd Division, sending it to survey the territory, while the 1st Division was ordered to follow it, not lagging behind even a step, acting in a coordinated manner and without hesitation, so as not to allow a threat within their ranks. Suddenly, as if from nowhere, a white monster materialized. A giant wolf with many bright red eyes, its mouth opened in an ominous roar, and the space around was instantly filled with a heavy feeling of an inevitable threat hanging over everyone. The monster rushed forward with a deafening roar, its huge paws with sharp claws leaving deep marks in the white fur, and its very appearance filled the space with horror, forcing everyone to freeze in fear and watch this terrible sight. The Duke, with amazing dexterity, dodged the powerful blow, instantly swung his sword and moved away from the monster, which was furiously trying to grab him with its sharp claws, while maintaining complete calm and fortitude despite the fact that the danger was inexorably approaching. The guards were dumbfounded and shocked. Usually their master did not dodge blows, but immediately fought, cutting the monster into 2 parts and mercilessly destroying everything in his path. But now he showed unusual caution, which caused confusion and doubt in them. Suddenly, Ferris, looking at his subordinates, turned to them with a sudden calmness in his voice, saying that he had one important question for them, which could perhaps radically change their further actions and plans in such a critical situation. The guards, who were not expecting such a turn of events, froze in alarm when they heard the strange question of whether the monster's white fur would go with the color pink, and each of them had doubts about how to answer this unusual request. And at that moment they realized that the Duke's wife had pink hair, which could not help but cause them deep surprise, because this unusual fact could play a decisive role in their current case, combining two seemingly incompatible elements. Full of determination and fire, they began to shout loudly, confident that these two colors were in perfect harmony with each other, supporting his desire to defeat the monster for the sake of his beloved wife and prove to everyone that he was right in this important battle. With a wild grin, full of rage and determination, the aristocrat shouted words full of anger and fury that he would do everything possible to kill the wolf, without stopping on the way, without sparing his strength, despite his beautiful and thick fur. The huge monster, overcome with unimaginable shock and panic fear, froze in place, unable to comprehend what was happening around him. His body was frozen in numbness, and his mind was consumed by complete chaos, not allowing him to react to what was happening at that moment. The loud screams and terrifying sounds of battle scared away a flock of crows, who took to the air in panic and scattered across the sky, as if they realized that something dangerous was happening on the ground and they could not stay here, in the midst of this chaotic and brutal battle. The noblewoman, with obvious satisfaction and interest, examined the new fur coat that her husband had brought her as a gift, white, unexpectedly warm and beautiful with a delicate fabric, ideal for the cold season around and pleasing to her eyes. While his wife continued to look at the gift with pleasure, the warrior, wiping his exhausted face from the blood and sweat that the brutal battle had left on his skin, felt how fatigue retreated, and the traces of the battle disappeared under his hands. Holding the fur in her hands, Littera could not help but thank her husband for such a wonderful fur coat, because he clearly tried for her sake, choosing a thing that would not only warm her on harsh and cold winter days, but also give her unforgettable moments of joy, comfort, and warmth. She waved her arms and began to try on a new item from her wardrobe, feeling her long pink hair fluttering in the light wind and the unusual white fur wrapping around her body, adding unimaginable lightness, beauty, and elegance to the image. With a bright smile on her face, turning to the sweet Duke, she asked him with interest how she looked in her new clothes, hoping to hear his admiration and approval, because it was important for her to know how beautiful she looked in this exquisite outfit. Ferris stood awkwardly frozen by the beauty of his wife, unable to tear his eyes away from her amazing image, and, as if having lost touch with reality, dropped everything he was holding in his hands, and his face remained emotionless, hiding all his feelings and experiences. After that, with a determined expression on his face, he headed out, determined to kill a few more dozens of these monsters for the sake of his wife's smile, and young Littera barely managed to stop him, managing to come up and restrain his impulse, not allowing him to continue. The upset nobleman, with a hint of bitterness in his voice, asked if she was not delighted with his gift, and she had to convince him that one fur coat was quite enough, because she was sincerely glad that he had spent so much effort for her happiness and comfort. Littera blushed from her husband's care, because his attention was so sincere and sweet that she felt a warm wave of gratitude in her heart, because not every man is able to show such kindness and care for his wife. The woman's hand rose into the air with ease and grace, as if trying to touch her interlocutor, and her fingers, graceful and refined, glided smoothly through the air, giving her entire gesture incredible lightness and charm, as if she were part of this moment. Ferris stroked her husband with a warm smile, saying words of gratitude because she could not help but notice how important it was for her that he showed such care and attention, doing everything so that she always felt loved, protected, and appreciated in any situation. The Duke blushed so much that his cheeks and even his ears turned bright red, and an awkward embarrassment arose in his chest, because he could not imagine that such a simple and sincere concern would cause such a strong reaction in him, filling his heart with warmth and shame. Lytera continued to smile, gently stroking him, and in her eyes one could read the readiness to do anything for her husband, because for her it was most important that he felt her unconditional love and support, despite any difficulties that might stand in their way. Suddenly, the man again tried to say something about fur coats, but the girl, unable to bear it, interrupted him in a stern tone, declaring that she did not need 100 fur coats, and that the attention and care that he gave her were much more important to her than material things. The maid combed her hair, watching her master closely, and said with a smile that he had changed a lot for the better since she started working for him, noting how much her presence in the house and her care for him had influenced him. The maid sighed heavily, and carefully combing her hair, could not help but notice that her master had not been like this before, and although he was not perfect, he always paid his servants well, which made his actions, although strict, fair and honest. The Duke's family was second in status among the aristocracy, second only to the imperial family, and their coat of arms, featuring lions, was known throughout the great kingdom, symbolizing the strength, power, wealth, and antiquity of the family in the eyes of their subjects. However, frightened by the growing influence of this powerful family, the emperor, fearing for his power, decided to get rid of all its members, killing everyone except the youngest son, who could become a hostage for his future, cunning and insidious plans. The young man was the only survivor of his family, and despite all his poverty and grief, he had no right to even mourn his relatives, forced to accept the title of duke and all the weight of responsibility that came with this status. The noblewoman could not fully believe the maid's words that her husband was a beast, because he always behaved exceptionally kindly with her, showing care and attention, creating the feeling that her life was full of nothing but warmth, love, and security. Ferris behaved so well only towards his lady wife, but he treated other nobles with contempt, with hatred, as if each of them was alien to his inner world, and he did not hide his disgust towards those around him. Lytera, completely shocked, froze in place. Her face seemed to darken with bewilderment, and she frowned as she tried to comprehend what was happening, unable to believe what was said, not believing her own ears, not understanding how everything had changed so quickly, and why her husband had become such a person. Very often nobles would faint, and a well-coordinated team would have to drag their bodies to the exit in order to urgently bring them back to consciousness and ensure their safety, which created great difficulties, forcing everyone to worry about their well-being. That was why the maid was so worried when the well-coordinated team first arrived at this majestic mansion, which was completely new and unknown to them, and the growing tension and anxiety for the state of the owners only increased her anxiety, causing her to lose her calm. In the hands of the maiden was an exquisite gold ornament with a purple stone that sparkled in the light like a precious emerald, radiating a mysterious and magical shine, attracting the glances of everyone who was nearby and leaving an indelible mark on their memory as a symbol of something rare. The maid carefully attached brooches to the Duchess's fur cape, calmly saying that all the servants were worried about her because they wanted her outfit to be perfect and for her to feel safe, surrounded by care and attention. Raising her index finger, the maid added with a slight smile that it was much more pleasant to work for the benefit of a happy master than for a gloomy one who always found a reason for dissatisfaction, because it created a completely different atmosphere in the house, full of warmth and harmony. Lytera walked through the empty corridors of the castle, dressed in a new warm fur coat, and felt her body fill with warmth, while the slight coolness from the stone walls only increased the feeling of coziness and comfort, creating a feeling of peace in this majestic but cold place. The way her husband took care of her, covering her with his cloak and showing attention, made her feel protected and loved, and she could never imagine that he could be cruel to other aristocrats because he was so good to her. The noblewoman was thinking about her husband, his care and attention, when a guard walked to the side, barely noticeable, and stopped, noticing the Duchess, and looked at her in surprise, not understanding what could have caused her to be so thoughtful. Without thinking twice, the man resolutely walked towards the Duchess, who, standing, rose with a light and graceful movement, her gaze full of expectation, as if she already felt that this conversation could open up new horizons for their communication. This young man, whose name was Canis, was a knight of the First Division and, despite his attractive appearance, came to express his sincere gratitude to the aristocrats for their kindness and support in difficult times. Without wasting any time, the lady immediately understood what he wanted to say, and as soon as she realized the essence of his words, the guard began to tell how much their house had changed with her arrival, emphasizing that her presence brought not only harmony, but also tangible changes to the atmosphere of the entire estate. The woman, puzzled and clearly perplexed, remembered that the maid had once told her something similar. Thanks to her efforts, their master had really changed, and these changes, in her opinion, had become a real blessing for him, improving his character. Slowly, as if everything had fallen into place, the lady began to realize why her husband had never put his own interests and feelings first in life, preferring his sacrifice and selflessness to his other duties and tasks. She was involuntarily transported back to the memories of their first meeting, when Ferris literally showered her with words of apology and pity, claiming that there would be many more minuses than positives for their marriage, which greatly shocked her and made her think. And then, after some time had passed, Littera quietly but confidently smiled and told her interlocutor that she would definitely do everything possible to make her husband truly happy, realize his dreams, and find peace in his life. In response to the confident words of the guard, who firmly stated that he would protect the lady with all his might, another man dressed in a dark fur coat approached the two of them. His steps sounded confident and decisive, as if he had long known that he should be here at this very moment. This man turned out to be Ferris, and his heart was filled with incredible joy and relief when he finally realized that he had found his beloved, the woman who was everything to him, and now he was eagerly rushing to her to be close again as before. He found his wife, who was currently having a pleasant conversation with another knight, and upon seeing this picture, he couldn't help but notice how they looked like a real, happy couple, which made his heart clench with misunderstanding and strange anxiety. Ferris stopped in his tracks. His breathing became heavier, and he fell silent, feeling a strange and hostile feeling growing in his soul, jealousy that engulfed him like a storm, difficult to fight and impossible to simply ignore. This feeling was like a strong snowstorm that covers him completely. It made him lose his breath, squeezing his chest heavily and penetrating his soul, leaving only a feeling of restlessness and dissatisfaction that did not give him a moment of peace. Ferris turned abruptly and walked away, never answering his wife's call, not wanting to disturb her. With a heavy heart, immersed in a heavy and restless sadness, he could no longer stay near her because everything seemed completely alien and misunderstood. But Littera noticed his hasty departure and, calling him by name, hurried to follow him, saying with a slight reproach in her voice that he should have at least tried to call her before leaving her in such confusion. Ferris, however, did not answer her. His thoughts were absorbed in gloomy reflections on the fact that this marriage for his wife, in all likelihood, was only an obstacle on the path to her own desires, aspirations, and ideals, and he could not put up with this. The beauty looked at the warrior's back in surprise, struck by his indifference and how easily he ignored her, leaving her confused and with feelings that she could not understand, comprehend, or justify to herself at the moment. She began to run after her husband, wondering what had happened between them, because he was taller and stronger, and therefore calmly walked forward, while she ran with difficulty after him, desperately trying to catch up with him, despite her fatigue and anxiety. Littera held out her hand, begging her husband to stop and not leave her alone. Her breathing became heavy, and there was a deep worry in her voice, as if she realized that there was a gap growing between them that could not be bridged if things continued as they were. Unable to bear it any longer, Littera fell to her knees, her body refusing to obey, and she clutched the wall with her hands, trying to somehow stay on her feet, but her strength left her, leaving her in a completely helpless state, having lost all confidence and sense of control. Immediately, in front of her face, her husband's hand appeared, covered with numerous scars. His determined gaze was full of care and tenderness. He tried to help her up, wondering if everything was okay with her, concerned about her condition and inner world. The warrior apologized for causing her discomfort and fatigue, realizing that his actions could not only cause her physical stress, but also leave a mark on her mental state, which he now realized with regret and understanding. After thinking and worrying for a long time, Litera took advantage of this moment, firmly grabbing her husband's fur coat with her hands, pulling him towards herself, feeling that now he would definitely not leave, and she managed to keep him, at least for a moment, in her closeness, and now she could feel his presence. With a sullen face, the lady declared that if her husband wanted to talk to her about something, she was ready to listen to him, not hiding the disappointment in her voice, feeling how the unsaid hung in the air, like a heavy awkward shadow between them, which made communication difficult. Ferris stepped back, his face clouded with a frustrated expression, and he admitted that his words sounded stupid, but his fear and doubt made him afraid to tell her directly, and Litera, as an experienced woman, made her own guesses, expecting nothing else. Continuing to hold her husband by his clothes so that he could not escape, Litera firmly stated her assumptions that he was afraid that he might be of no use to her, and therefore simply ran away, leaving her in bewilderment and confusion about his actions and deeds. Ferris asked curiously if his beloved could read his mind, to which she replied that he was indeed that hero with low self-esteem, who was afraid of not living up to her expectations and was prone to self-criticism despite his strength. After this, Litera, with obvious concern in her voice, explained that she had recently spoken to the servants in secret from her husband, discussing him, and that she felt that her husband was hiding a lot, and perhaps she should look into it more carefully and carefully. Sweat slowly rolled down his face, his gaze was cast downwards, and a frustrated expression appeared on Ferris's face as he said that it seemed like his wife now knew how insignificant and helpless he felt, losing confidence in his own strength and personal qualities. The man finally admitted that, looking at himself from the outside, he saw only a stupid fool who did not know how to properly communicate with ladies, and realized how he was an unloved, cruel, and even frightening beast, hiding behind a cold outer appearance. Ferris continued to slander himself, preparing himself for the fact that his wife would probably leave him, unable to bear his weakness and shortcomings, but she, not wanting to listen to these self-deprecating words any longer, reached out to his face and gently asked him to stop talking such nonsense. Gently and tenderly, Litera lifted her husband's face, embracing him with her arms, filling the space around them with warmth and care, giving him confidence that her love had not weakened and that she would be there, despite his doubts and worries. The warrior was flushed with embarrassment, his cheeks were burning, and despite all his efforts to hide his awkwardness, he felt the warmth of her hands penetrate his heart, filling him not only with confusion, but also with a surprising feeling of vulnerability and inner bewilderment. Without thinking twice, she suddenly and unexpectedly hit her husband in the face with her forehead in order to bring him out of his state of confusion and return him to reality, filling his consciousness with a sharp pain that made him come to his senses for a moment and realize that he had no right to continue to weaken like this. She began to shout loudly at her husband, pointing her finger at him and demanding that he finally come to his senses, pull himself together, stop complaining, and finally stop his whining, because their life required much more willpower, courage, and determination than he showed. Pressing her hand to her chest, the noblewoman reminded him with a deep sense of pain in her voice that she was the same person as he was, and that she had already lived through 2 lives, both of which had ended unsuccessfully, but she did not allow herself to remain in despair and weakness for long. The nobleman knelt before his beauty, listening to her words with a heavy heart and a feeling of bitterness, believing that she was unfairly scolding herself because, despite her experiences and doubts, she remained much stronger than she would like to admit. Litera admitted that she promised her husband's servants and friends that she would take care of him and make him happy, despite all the difficulties that they would have to endure together, because she sincerely believed in his strength, potential, and opportunities that he himself did not notice. She extended her hand to her husband, urging him to stand up and stop wallowing in self-pity, because life cannot continue in such a mood, and in order to be truly happy, one must start acting and overcome all one's internal limitations. The warrior's mouth dropped open in shock. He had not expected to hear such words from his wife, and this unexpectedness literally stunned him, causing him to momentarily lose the ability to react to what was happening, despite his usual fortitude, and his mind froze in surprise. At that moment, Littera looked like a goddess. Her smile, her beauty, her light, and her whole posture were like a living flower, and with playful sarcasm she added that if her husband did not take her hand, then perhaps he would be comfortable spending the whole day on the floor, which slightly dispelled his gloomy mood. Finally, the man's hand gently lay on top of the woman's, and he accepted her help, feeling how his internal barriers began to crumble, and his heart filled with gratitude and tenderness for the one who did not give up, despite all his weaknesses and internal torments. And so, together, holding hands, they went for a walk along the long corridor, like a couple in love, not paying attention to the world around them, absorbed in each other and in the moment, which was filled with something touching and intimate. The two hands were joined, the woman's fragile and tender, the man's with scars and abrasions, each of which told its own story, in which there was not only suffering, but also the strength that had gone through pain, and now they were together as never before. The warrior, all red from shyness, walked behind his wife, trying to keep up, and she, sullenly absorbed in her thoughts, thought about how strange it was to see him in love, because before he seemed cold and distant to her, but now everything was different. The man looked head over heels in love, his eyes never left his wife, and one could read true love in his gaze. Little hearts seemed to light up in his pupils, and the blush on his cheeks only emphasized his embarrassment and deep feelings for her. Having decided to take responsibility for her husband, the lady continued to walk forward, confidently leading the Duke behind her, and he obediently walked, not daring to retreat, feeling how everything around him began to change, and how his own heart was filled with new, previously unknown feelings. But as she remembered her death, she felt her pink hair, which had fallen to the floor, softly touch the ground, and at that moment, the maiden felt a deep fear, realizing that she could not even take care of herself, that her life was too complicated to cope with. Suddenly, dear Ferris, who was standing behind, stopped, and as if noticing his wife's excitement, asked her not to worry, that his calmness and support could help her overcome any difficulties that did not stand in the way of their shared happiness. With his strong hand he squeezed the door handle, opening the door, and the light that poured into the dark corridor seemed to dispel the shadow of all worries and doubts, filling the space with hope, warmth, and confidence that everything would be fine, and that there was only a bright future ahead. Before going out into the yard, Ferris said that his wife could do whatever she wanted in his house, that he would not tolerate any restrictions for her because he hated to burden her with any responsibilities and wanted her to feel free and confident in her choices. To the noblewoman's surprised question whether he could read her thoughts, Ferris awkwardly scratched his head, feeling his embarrassment filling him, and replied that, of course, he could not read thoughts, but would always be there to understand her feelings and support her in any difficult moment. The men's footsteps were firm and confident, cutting through the silence of the winter cold as they walked down the street covered in fresh snow. The air was cold and piercing, which increased the feeling of loneliness and tension in their relationship, like an invisible wall between them. Now Littera followed her husband, looking down, feeling how her husband's warm and cozy cloak carefully envelops her, creating a feeling of security, like an invisible protection from the entire cold and unfriendly world that surrounded them at this difficult moment. With his back to his lady, the nobleman quietly admitted that he could not ask her for more than what she had already done for him. She had given him her care, her love and support, and that was more than enough for him to feel complete and secure. To this, Littera, with a heavy heart, admitted that, unfortunately, she could not support him now and respond to his feelings, since she was experiencing deeply personal and internal problems, and even realized that she was somewhat hypocritical in her words and actions. Squeezing her hand in his manly palm, Ferris denied her words, assuring her that his wife was not stupid or selfish, and that he understood her feelings and concerns perfectly, but hoped that they could figure it out together, supporting each other in the most difficult situations. He gently asked her not to regret her actions, because it was she who helped him become a truly happy person. All her actions, no matter how difficult they seemed, were correct, and he believed that every step she took was inevitable and necessary for their future. With a self-critical and slightly painful smile, the lady continued to talk about herself, admitting that although she had promised to be his companion for life, she still often did not listen to his advice and made decisions that seemed right to her, without taking into account his opinion. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by the sound that came when Litera suddenly stumbled and, without noticing how it happened, got stuck in the snow, with each movement only sinking deeper into the soft snowdrift, which attracted the attention of her husband and made him pay attention to her. A little embarrassed, Litera quickly apologized for ruining the moment with her awkwardness, realizing that she was now stuck in the snowdrift and feeling awkward because she hadn't expected to find herself in such a predicament at the most inopportune moment. Ferris didn't waste a second. His determination was evident as he walked up to Litera, carefully picked her up in his arms as if she were a fragile treasure, and hugging her tightly, he easily pulled her out of the snowdrift, giving her a feeling of safety and warmth despite the awkwardness of the moment. Ignoring the cries of his beautiful wife, the Duke resolutely let her go, and, not allowing the lady to lag behind, began to climb the steep stairs, continuing to hold her arm with unyielding determination, as if it were a matter of honor and devotion. Ferris expressed his fear that if she did not warm up properly and continued to be exposed to the cold, there was a real risk that her health would fail her again and she could become ill again, which worried him greatly, especially in such severe cold weather and late at night. The nobleman insisted that they return to the house where they could warm themselves without deciding to go further into the cold at once, while Litera felt embarrassed and blushed at the unexpected interference, realizing her helplessness and embarrassment. A bright fire blazed cheerfully in the fireplace, its flames playfully dancing, reflecting the dancing reflections on the walls, and the crackling logs added coziness to the atmosphere, creating an atmosphere of warmth and peace on this icy, piercingly cold winter evening, inviting solitude, communication, and relaxation. The boots were removed and carefully placed in a corner, but snow fell from them onto the floor, melting, leaving wet marks on the wooden floor, a reminder of how the cold air had penetrated their cozy home, creating a contrast with the warmth of the room. The men's hands, full of tenderness and care, carefully warmed the women's feet in the warm water, slowly warming them up, as if every touch brought softness and peace, creating the feeling that the warmth penetrated every nerve of her tired and frozen body. He ignored her protests, which she voiced with quiet displeasure, insisting that she let him continue warming her cold feet, because even despite her objections, they remained icy, and he wanted to help her. The noblewoman smiled tensely, not understanding what the Duke's unexpected concern was connected with, because, in her opinion, there was nothing wrong with the fact that she had simply gotten her feet wet, and it was not worth such close attention and unnecessary concern. The aristocrat had truly remarkable arms, strong, confident, with defined, beautifully outlined muscles, and his rolled-up sleeves gave his appearance a special elegance, emphasizing his noble bearing, posture, and impeccable appearance. Ferris gently but insistently asked the girl to lean back in her chair so that he could comfortably position himself in front of her and slowly massage her legs, carefully kneading every muscle, helping to relieve tension, fatigue, and the overwork accumulated during the day. Strong hands massaged her fragile ankles with care and attention. His fingers moved confidently and skillfully, penetrating deep into tense muscles, making her feel relaxed, pleasantly warm and light spreading throughout her body. The Duke's hands were covered in old and fresh bruises, calluses, and scars left by years of hard training and fierce battles, each of which was a silent testimony to his strength, resilience, determination, and unyielding will to win. Litera sighed heavily and gently explained that, in her opinion, compared to his hard life as a knight, full of trials and battles, her own, filled with social duties and refined manners, seemed simple to her, like a carefree play of fate. As an argument, the noblewoman slowly stretched out her hands forward, showing him her palms. soft with snow-white skin, devoid of any scars, calluses, or traces of hard work, as if confirming the difference in their destinies and proving how differently their lives had turned out. Ferris thought for a moment, then slowly said that not everyone is equal in this world, because scars can appear not only on the outside but also on the inside, hiding in the depths of the soul, leaving invisible traces that cannot be seen with the eye, but they carry no less pain than physical ones. The man looked away, as if lost in his own thoughts for a second, and then admitted that he could not even imagine what it meant to die twice, having survived the most terrible line, beyond which there remains only emptiness, darkness, and an unknown secret that can change everything inside. The lady who found herself in a difficult situation was clearly not an ordinary woman, because not everyone is destined to experience such difficulties, cope with a painful rebirth, find the strength to move on and still remain herself, despite the pain, fear, and inevitable changes. But Lytera never gave up, never allowed herself to give up, but continued to fight for her life, despite all the difficulties and trials. She went to the cold, merciless north, hoping to save herself, find new support and prove that her spirit cannot be broken. With gentle care and extreme precision, Ferris began to dry his wife's tender feet with a soft, warm towel after a long, relaxing massage, trying not to cause her the slightest discomfort, but only to give her a feeling of warmth, comfort, peace, and light tranquility. Raising his head, the Duke looked at her attentively and, hesitating a little, asked whether he had said anything unnecessary, to which the lady hastened to reassure him, smiling softly and assuring him that everything was in perfect order because she felt much better than before. She had not expected to meet someone so understanding, so sensitive to her feelings, and so her hands, lying on her knees, involuntarily clenched into weak fists, betraying the emotions that overwhelmed her, which she could not cope with. With her hands, like wings, the girl carefully embraced her companion's head, begging him to wait a little and not rush her while she tried to cope with the overwhelming feelings, overcome internal barriers, and gain confidence before deciding to take the next step. Then, with a slight smile on her lips, Lytera gently touched her husband's forehead with her lips, as if sealing in this kiss a silent promise that very soon she would collect her thoughts, find the right words, and would definitely respond to his sincere feelings the way he deserved. Ferris, flushed to the roots of his hair and dyed the color of dawn from embarrassment, jerked back sharply, as if from an unexpected blow, loudly exclaiming in a breaking voice, trying to understand what his seemingly modest and reasonable wife had just done. The lady, watching this comical reaction, only laughed loudly and cheerfully, not missing the opportunity to tease her shy husband who, desperately trying to hide his embarrassment, could not calm the heat that colored his ears and cheeks a rich scarlet hue. When she was asked the unexpected question of whether they could become a truly harmonious married couple, the man, confused, just covered his mouth with his hand, looking away, and then, taking a deep breath with a warm smile, promised that he would do his best. Rumors quickly spread among the glittering society, which did not miss a single piquant detail that the infamous Beast Duke had finally tied the knot with the strangest girl in the kingdom, the mad daughter of a provincial baron. The light sounds of a waltz were carried under the vaults of the luxurious ballroom, and in the refined circles of aristocrats, talk did not cease about the mysterious noblewoman who was already over 20, but who, to the great surprise of all present, had never honored a single important ball with her appearance. Like an exotic butterfly caught in a web of curious glances, she found herself at the center of discussions. Her name was whispered behind people's backs, and her presence, like a stigma, fell heavily on the shoulders of her family, causing them to blush in front of high society. The nobles could not calm down, savoring every detail of this strange union, discussing again and again the crazy girl who, by an absurd whim of fate, found herself tied in marriage with the mysterious and frightening Beast Duke. In the eyes of high society, they seemed like a couple created by fate itself. Two strangers, exiles in the world of court intrigue, strange, rejected, forced to seek solace, not in the radiance of crystal chandeliers and the rustle of dresses, but in the silence of secluded corridors. But amidst all this gossip, there was one man who not only did not want to put up with this strange and absurd, in his opinion, union, but was also determined to destroy it at any cost, shaking the air with a thunderous blow of his fist on the heavy oak table. This person turned out to be none other than the girl's father, a man with short-cropped hair, a distrustful look, and an expression of deep displeasure that had not left his face from the very moment he learned of his daughter's decision. A carriage pulled by stately horses, swiftly cutting through the morning fog, rolled along the cobbled streets of the city. The coachman sat confidently in front, holding the reins in his calloused hands, and in the depths of the carriage, hidden by heavy curtains, a conversation between the spouses flared up. The girl's mother, with her hands folded on her knees, said with concern in her voice that it was not too late to take up a pen, write a stern letter, and demand that their rebellious daughter immediately return home, far from these cold northern lands and the man whose reputation inspired fear. However, her husband, with a wave of his hand to the side, interrupted her, with visible annoyance, throwing out that, despite all his anger, he was only worried about their baby. But his wife, on the contrary, seemed confident that these terrible rumors about the Duke were nothing more than exaggerated tales of idle gossips. With a heavy sigh, the nobleman, with noticeable anxiety in his voice, said that he had personally witnessed a frightening spectacle when, during a lavish imperial banquet, he himself had the chance to see a mysterious beast of cold, whose presence caused confusion and tension among the guests in the hall. The enraged man, as if he had lost his mind, smashed everything that came to his hands in anger. His strength seemed inhuman, and his movements resembled a mad whirlwind, as if he really was that very monster, capable of smashing to pieces everything that dared to stand in his way. His scarlet eyes, glowing like molten metal, sparkled in the semi-darkness. His smile, revealing sharp teeth, looked frightening, and the rage boiling inside him seemed to shake the air itself, filling the space around with an oppressive atmosphere of inevitable catastrophe. The wife, trying to convince her angry husband, said that if everything had really happened exactly as he claimed, then the mysterious beast of cold would have been immediately imprisoned. But the Baron only grinned and replied that the Emperor himself found the behavior amusing. The ruler, lounging on his luxurious throne, said mockingly that since he was not afraid to invite to the ball the one who was called a monster, now the Duke, if he wished, had every right to ignore such invitations in the future and no longer appear at such events. Looking away sullenly, the nobleman finished his story, gloomily adding that from that very day Ferris never left the cold north again, and could never understand why his only daughter made such a strange decision, to marry the monster of the cold which everyone feared. With her arms folded thoughtfully across her chest, the main character's mother quietly replied that perhaps they really should be prepared for bloodshed if they wanted to bring their daughter home, since it seemed she was destined for an unenviable fate, and there were no peaceful ways to resolve this problem left. In their minds, Lytera was an innocent victim, a fragile girl who had fallen into the hands of a ruthless monster, an evil vampire, a gloomy duke who, having captured her, now did not want to let her go and hid her in his icy chambers like a precious trophy. The castle, encased in the icy armor of winter, towered among the silent snowdrifts, like an ancient giant that has kept its unknown secrets for centuries. The fierce wind, penetrating the cracks of the centuries-old walls, howled and moaned like the voices of long-gone shadows that dissolved into eternity. Squeezing her husband's hand, the young girl, with resentment in her voice, reproached her parents for at least warning them before their unexpected arrival, while her husband politely apologized for the fact that they were unable to greet their dear guests properly. Shocked and speechless, the girl's mother and father froze in place, not expecting to see that their beloved daughter, contrary to their previous doubts, looked quite pleased with her marriage, and even radiated a special calmness that had previously been unknown to them. With gentle care in his movements, Ferris invited his wife to sit down, elegantly pulled out a chair for her, and then gently pulled the back, creating a comfortable space for her, as if in this gesture he wanted to express all his tenderness and respect. With her arms folded across her chest, the wife looked intently at her husband, who seemed stunned by the realization that his little girl, whom he had cherished all her life, was being treated here as nothing less than a true princess, surrounded by care and respect, like a precious treasure. Contrary to gloomy expectations, instead of a bloodthirsty monster, a refined and polite nobleman named Ferris appeared before the family, who discreetly inquired about the reason for the sudden visit of his wife's parents, showing sincere attention to them and not hostility. Unlike her confused husband, the beauty's mother firmly stated that she had not come at all for a polite visit, but with the sole purpose of making sure with her own eyes that her precious daughter was safe and that she was truly completely fine. Litera, in turn, did not hide her surprise at the sudden appearance of her parents, because she could not even imagine that they were so worried about her that they decided to take such a long and, perhaps, difficult road, guided only by the anxiety in their hearts. In this life, her parents seemed to be reborn, becoming caring and attentive, although in the past, when she was still a child, they often left her without attention, as if she was just a shadow in their house, which could easily be overlooked, ignoring all her feelings and experiences. Litera shifted awkwardly, carefully trying to remind them that once upon a time her mother and father had shown no interest in her at all, but before she could finish her sentence, her father suddenly slammed his fist on the table, drowning out her voice and cutting off any further words. His face was distorted with anger, and without holding back his emotions, he was furiously indignant that his daughter could utter such cruel words, because they always took care of her, put her to bed when she was sick, worried about her poor health, and did everything possible to protect her from adversity. The Baron, his eyes flashing angrily, loudly accused Litera of betraying her family by marrying the evil monster of the north, but despite his loud cries, a heavy silence hung over the table. Ferris and his wife sat silently, not responding to the accusations. The Duke slowly rose from his seat and, casting a cold glance at those present, firmly said that he had not come here just like that, but in order to take his daughter back home, since he and his wife did not intend to put up with such a son-in-law. Realizing what he had just said and to whom, the Baron suddenly fell silent, covering his mouth with his hands, as if hoping to take back the unspoken words, and his wife, crossing her arms over her chest, looked at him mockingly and venomously asked which of the two of them had now shown rudeness and impatience. Ferris sighed heavily, tiredly running his hand over his temple, and, maintaining his composure, calmly assured his wife's parents that they should not worry, because since childhood he had been accustomed to the fact that those around him called him a monster, a beast, and other unflattering nicknames. Litera, frowning, objected, declaring that her father had every right to feel angry since it was natural for him, but the Duke simply waved her off, not wanting to continue this argument, as if these explanations did not bother him at all and did not have any special meaning for him. And then, after a short pause, he coughed in embarrassment, suddenly looked away, and with unexpected sincerity admitted that he was actually glad of the opportunity to talk to his beloved's father, because it was his duty to become a worthy, respectful son-in-law. The Baron froze as if turned to stone, his wide-open eyes reflecting a deep inner conflict, and his fingers, previously clenched into fists, slowly unclenched. Like a bolt from the blue, Ferris's words shook him to the depths of his soul, and a shadow of doubt flashed in his stern gaze. Without any emotion, the beauty calmly stated that her husband, being a very sensitive person, simply fainted because of such a seemingly insignificant trifle, as if he had been struck by an unprecedented shock and not by ordinary words spoken in the heat of an argument. The woman irritably waved away the angry old man, not wanting to listen to his moralizing, and with obvious boredom in her voice, noted that it would be much more interesting to hear how exactly her daughter married the Duke, because this story clearly deserved more attention. The young couple at that moment involuntarily shuddered, hearing such an unexpected question, because before they had never had to think about something like this, and most importantly, They really had never met before the wedding, and their union was as sudden as this family conversation. Lyra felt her cheeks heat up and, looking down, awkwardly began to tell them that there had been a secret correspondence between them for a long time, which, she claimed, had served as the basis for their relationship. However, even in her own voice, she detected uncertainty. However, her beautiful mother only shook her head in disbelief, clearly not believing such a story, and firmly asked her not to try to turn this serious conversation into a stupid joke, but to be more honest and tell only one true truth. Sighing in frustration, the woman looked tiredly at her daughter and asked with a slight mockery if she couldn't come up with something more plausible if she had already decided to lie, since her story sounded so implausible that it didn't stand up to any criticism. After all, she knew her little girl very well and understood that her daughter had always been drawn to handsome, refined young men with a gentle character, and not to stern and rude men like her current husband, which only increased her distrust of this story. Lyra shuddered, her heart began to beat faster, and, unable to restrain herself, she almost shouted, demanding an explanation of how her mother could know such things, since she herself had never said anything like that, and certainly had not discussed her preferences with her. For the Duke, this was a real revelation about his own wife, something he had not even suspected. But before he could say a word, Lyra quickly took control of the situation, looking at him with embarrassment and firmly asking him not to bother his head with her mother's words and not to attach special importance to them. Clutching her head, the aristocrat sighed heavily, finally deciding to stop talking about the wedding, but still could not resist expressing her displeasure. She complained that her daughter could at least have announced her intentions to get married in advance. Lyra, shifting awkwardly in her chair, felt guilty and quietly apologized for the fact that her parents found out about her wedding from strangers and not from her, because she really should have told them earlier, but for some reason she was never able to do so. The lady calmly took a small sip from her glass, after which she simply shook her head, refusing to accept this apology. Instead, she acknowledged that the fault for what happened lay not only with her daughter, but also with her and her husband, because perhaps they themselves were not attentive enough. Feeling her husband's warm hand gently covering her palm, Lyra froze for a moment, and then nodded with a slight smile, agreeing that here, in this cold castle, she really felt calm, confident, and most importantly, truly happy. The noblewoman said quietly, with a soft smile, that it was all because of her husband, because it was thanks to him that she felt so calm and comfortable in the north, despite the cold and harsh conditions that had previously seemed frightening and unfriendly to her. The woman, crossing her arms over her chest, sighed calmly, her stern gaze softened, and her voice sounded genuinely warm. She was happy for her daughter, even though she had not expected such a bold choice from her, but now, seeing her happiness, she could not help but acknowledge the obvious. Looking at her unconscious husband, Mother Lyra hesitated for a moment, and then suggested that they stay here for a few days, so that the Baron could come to his senses, recover from the shock, and perhaps look at the situation with a more sober head, rather than through the prism of anger and prejudice. Darkness enveloped the high ceilings of the hall, a luxurious chandelier cast soft reflections on the marble floor, and beyond the massive windows stretched a road leading to a majestic mansion, whose walls held more secrets than one could imagine. Lyra, slightly embarrassed, lowering her gaze, quietly apologized to her husband for the unexpected visit of her parents, feeling guilty for their sudden appearance, to which he, standing next to her in a soft robe, calmly replied with a smile that sooner or later he was obliged to meet his mother and father anyway. Placing a warm hand on her head, the Duke murmured thoughtfully that it seemed the girl's father had not taken a great liking to him, to put it mildly, and it would take him a long time to change his first impression. Suddenly, smiling reservedly, Ferris unexpectedly started a conversation about the fact that her father had mentioned one curious fact. As a child, Lyra was often ill, but why did he, her legal husband, still not know anything about this? Because such an important detail could not go unnoticed? Squeezing the heavy fabric of her dress with her thin fingers, barely hiding her excitement, the maiden quietly admitted that in her past life her body was incredibly weak. fragile, like glass, and any wrong step or even a light wind could cause her unbearable suffering. Her holy protection was gone, no longer protecting her from troubles and misfortunes, and now she herself was responsible for her rebirth, for her soul, for her own destiny, and for every day she lived, no matter what trials the merciless life prepared for her. Clutching her head and bursting into unexpected, almost hysterical laughter, Litera exclaimed that she had never imagined how much her parents would continue to worry about her, as if she were still a small, helpless child who needed to be protected from any possible misfortune. Ferris's face remained sympathetic. In the depths of his attentive gaze one could read a slight pity, but not for the young beauty herself, but for how much she had to endure, what pain she had gone through, and how many fears she had to overcome. Litera waved it off, trying to sound confident that she was perfectly fine, but Ferris saw the truth. His wife was in incredible pain. Her breathing was ragged, and at one point it seemed that she was about to lose consciousness, as if she was once again on the brink between life and painful death. Sitting down near the large window, crossing her graceful hands on her knees, the girl quietly, almost in a whisper, whispered that in fact everything was not as bad as her dear husband could have imagined, and that in her opinion there were simply no reasons for great concern. Moreover, in their long, tender letters that they exchanged before the wedding, Litera sincerely sought to get to know the Duke better, desperately hoping that she could understand his heart, his thoughts, his true nature, and what was hidden behind the cold mask. The lady looked down in embarrassment, blushing from the overwhelming feelings, and was noticeably nervous, and then, stumbling a little, said that for a long time she had believed that she alone had feelings for the aristocrat, and that her tender affection, her dreams, had never been reciprocated by him. Ferris, flushed to the ears, stood frozen in complete confusion, his eyes wide open in surprise, his thoughts confused, not allowing him to immediately find the right words. He clearly had not expected such a turn of events, and his heart began to beat faster, as if trying to comprehend what he had heard. The lady, feeling no less awkward herself, timidly lowered her gaze, gathering her courage, and quietly suggested a divorce, if such was the aristocrat's true desire. The beautiful beauty did not want to become a burden to a man who, as it seemed to her, might not share her feelings. Extending a strong but surprisingly warm hand, he carefully grabbed his beloved by the wrist, helping her to rise from her seat, and in a firm, soulful voice said that he would always be there for her, that he would never leave her alone, and that being with her made him truly happy. To her husband's sincere words and his ardent, devoted request to allow him to protect her from all troubles and adversities, Litera, taking a deep breath, finally agreed with a slight smile, considering this gesture a manifestation of true, genuine love and even accepting his care as a great honor. But before finally trusting her husband, the beauty stubbornly, with a slight challenge in her voice, asked him to at least try to make peace with her father because, despite everything, she could not leave the feud between them without an attempt at reconciliation. Lying on her husband's lap, the noblewoman thoughtfully reflected on how difficult it was to change the deep-rooted prejudices about her, because people were used to seeing her only as a reflection of other people's opinions, and not who she really was, and this caused her a lot of emotional distress. Suddenly, a brilliant idea flashed in her head, and, clapping her fingers with a sly smile, the noblewoman confidently declared that they should prove to her father that their union was strong and harmonious, and therefore there was simply no point in worrying because their feelings were genuine. Squeezing her husband's strong shoulder with her palms, she gave him a warm, shining smile, and with undisguised delight suggested going on a romantic date to spend time together, forgetting about all worries and doubts, at least for one evening. The man, despite his love for his wife, remained immersed in doubts, and, shaking his head discreetly, he followed her down the corridor, feeling uneasy and uncertain because the idea seemed risky to him, and the consequences could be completely unpredictable. Behind them, remaining in the shadow of the corridor, the noblewoman's father walked unnoticed, his gaze full of anxiety and tension, because in his soul he feared that this formidable beast of the north, with whom his daughter had linked her fate, was capable of causing her pain or disappointment. Watching their every move with a dark, piercing gaze, the aristocrat frowned, feeling rage boiling in his chest, squeezing his heart with an iron hoop, and his fingers, as if on their own, dug into the cold stone wall, as if in an attempt to hold back the raging storm of indignation. In his mind, the image of the Duke was still unchanged. A wild beast, a monster hiding under the mask of a noble title, and not a man capable of giving love and protecting those dear to him, and this only caused a new wave of rage. His hands trembled slightly, his thoughts filled with indignation did not give him peace, and deeply convinced of his own rightness, he continued to consider this scoundrel as nothing more than a wandering, insatiable predator who only pretended to be a worthy husband to his precious daughter. That is why, throughout their entire date, the Baron followed the young couple closely, hiding in the shadows, watching their every move, carefully tracking down the slightest reason to intervene and protect his only daughter from what he believed to be impending disaster. Hiding in the dark corners of the street, he was full of confidence that he would be able to uncover all their carefully hidden secrets, expose the deception in which, in his opinion, there could not be a drop of sincerity, and finally prove to himself that his fears were not at all groundless. But suddenly a quiet but confident voice was heard behind him, and turning around, he met the piercing gaze of his wife, who, crossing her arms over her chest, wearily asked how much longer he intended to engage in this senseless stupidity. The aristocrat only shook her head with a slight sigh, a barely noticeable smile touched her lips, and coming closer, she softly but firmly said that all this surveillance was pointless, because the truth, whatever it was, had long been lying on the surface. Although he heard every word she said perfectly well, Ferris chose to pretend to be as deaf as the icy wind blowing through the streets, and turned away, continuing the conversation, pretending that his mind was immersed in far more meaningful thoughts than his wife's calm but insightful words. Around them stretched snow-covered streets, frozen in icy silence. The trees kept their frozen secrets, and winter, shrouded in a cold wind, silently watched their strange game, like an ancient guardian, indifferent to human experiences and hidden passions. The wife took several confident steps forward, fully aware that if she did not bring her stubborn husband to his senses, he would continue to endlessly disturb the young couple, preventing them from building their lives without his obsessive presence and senseless suspicions. With this thought in mind, the beauty resolutely walked towards her young daughter and son-in-law, greeting them with a warm smile and a welcoming gesture, as if wanting to diffuse the tense atmosphere, while her husband continued to be tormented by his doubts in the cold shadow of the corridor. The Baron stood alone, his face darkening, and a new wave of disappointment rose in his soul. His own wife had betrayed his trust, choosing the side of those he suspected, instead of supporting his desire to reveal the truth. Walking slowly down the long, dimly lit corridor, he thought sullenly that since spying on the Duke had not yielded the desired results, it was time to reconsider his strategy and find another, more effective way to get to the truth. Suddenly the Baron noticed how the nobleman's servants were quietly whispering nearby. Their voices were muffled, and their glances darted from side to side, as if they were discussing something that should not fall into his ears, something secret and, possibly, dangerous. Judging by their wary looks, it was something important that needed to be hidden from prying eyes at any cost, and so the girl's father immediately became wary, feeling that he could not afford to miss the opportunity to learn the hidden truth that could change everything. He decided to follow the servants unnoticed, hiding behind the columns and blending into the shadows, trying not to give away his presence while he carefully watched their work, catching every word, every gesture, every suspicious look, hoping to catch at least a hint of their secret. Meanwhile, the Duke, unaware of the surveillance, praised one of the servants for his work, but the praise was followed by a serious look. It seemed that a problem had arisen that needed to be solved, but neither he nor his subordinates knew that in the darkness there was an attentive observer ready to reveal their secret. The Baron winced as he realized that his carefully planned cover was no longer working, that his presence had been discovered, and all attempts to hide had been in vain. And at that moment his mouth fell open in mute horror, fear gripping his muscles, leaving him in a state of numbness before the inevitable. The man confidently stepped towards the heavy velvet curtain, pulled it back sharply, and before him stood his father-in-law, whose unexpected appearance made him experience a mixture of rage and fear. But, suppressing his emotions, he muttered that he had hidden this carefully guarded secret even from his own wife. Closing his tired eyes, the man finally realized the hopelessness of his situation. His breathing became ragged, his mind froze, his body was frozen in cold horror, and, feeling how hopelessness was growing inside, he realized that the only thing left for him was to meekly await his inevitable death. But instead of imminent death, when the room was illuminated by a soft light, the Baron was presented with a sight that he could not have expected. For before his astonished eyes there appeared a spacious, exquisitely decorated room, filled with the warm glow of numerous lamps. The girl's astonished father finally realized that in front of him was nothing other than a magnificent ballroom, exquisitely furnished, shimmering with the light of numerous chandeliers, every detail of which emphasized the wealth and grandeur of this place, leaving him in admiring bewilderment. Clearing his throat and straightening up, the Duke said with a smile that he had dreamed of arranging a cozy and festive dinner for the family. But, as it turned out, his carefully guarded surprise had been revealed ahead of time, and now there was nothing left to do but accept this unexpected turn of events. Suddenly, a servant intervened in their tense conversation, and the maid, not hiding the satisfied expression on her face, announced that it was she who had deliberately brought the Baron here, acting not by chance but with a certain intent, and her words caused a wave of bewilderment among those present. The nobleman froze in shock, his gaze darkened with disappointment, an internal anxiety washed over him in a dark wave, and he could not understand how it happened that his carefully thought-out plan collapsed in an instant, leaving behind only a feeling of complete powerlessness. To the question of the strict and insightful father of his wife Ferris, restraining his emotions, calmly answered that he did not hold a grudge against him at all, because he had never had any reason to be offended, and his heart did not hold the slightest shadow of discontent or indignation. Folding his arms across his chest, the old man admitted with a slight grin that he had previously behaved too rudely, had not hidden his distrust, and had allowed himself to spy on his daughter's husband, and perhaps had even seen him as a rival, refusing to acknowledge him as a worthy man and take him seriously as an equal. A thin drop of sweat trickled down Ferris's face, and, feeling his gaze, he hastened to justify himself, insisting that he had not meant anything bad, that he had never wanted to cause hostility, and that the Baron, of course, had every right to be wary of him, since at their first meeting he had not shown the best manners. Back then, at the imperial banquet, his behavior resembled more that of a wild beast than a nobleman, and it was quite logical that from that moment on, those around him began to feel fear, because his gaze, cold posture, and abrupt movements left behind a sense of danger. Beating his chest with a force that betrayed his sincerity, the man added with a warm smile that, despite everything, he felt genuine joy that his wife had such wonderful parents, and this thought filled his heart with a pleasant, almost familial warmth. The Baron froze in complete amazement, realizing the man's unexpectedly warm and respectful attitude toward his daughter, which was rare and unusual for him, but nevertheless left a pleasant feeling of relief and even a subtle admiration in his soul. Lytera truly deserved the best, because her graceful appearance resembled a work of art. Iridescent pink hair fell softly on her shoulders, her hands were neatly folded near her chest, and her eyelashes trembled gently, covering a thoughtful, light-filled gaze. Exhausted by his experiences, the nobleman slowly sank down onto the steps of the spacious room, clasping his hands in front of him, spreading his legs and allowing the tension to leave his body. At that moment he felt how fatigue slowly filled him, plunging him into a state of thoughtful peace. Silently he looked up, taking in the mesmerizing sight of the clear ceiling, illuminated by the golden glow of the candles, which cast a soft, warm light, creating a feeling of coziness and solemnity, as if the very atmosphere of the room was trying to shelter him from disturbing thoughts. Ferris shuddered when the voice of his father-in-law rang out in the silence, speaking about his daughter, whose birth had been a difficult test because from the very first days of her life she had been fragile, weak, and every day she lived was perceived as a precious gift of fate. Because of this innate weakness, Litera was forced to spend most of her time in bed. Unable to enjoy the joys of youth, she did not attend balls or social receptions, remaining in the shadows, and over time, cruel tongues began to call her the disgrace of the family. Suddenly, the girl's father unexpectedly broke the silence, looking at his son-in-law with a slight grin, and crossing his arms over his chest, said that if he really intended to throw a banquet, then let him make it truly memorable, such that people would talk about it for many years to come. Litera, like a delicate pink rosebud, blossomed more and more with each passing day, gaining strength and resilience, gradually transforming from a fragile, defenseless creature into a woman whose beauty and inner light grew ever brighter, as if in defiance of fate. Looking at his wife's father, who sat quietly, watching him with mild curiosity, Ferris bowed his head in respect and promised that he would arrange for them the most magnificent banquet, which would not just be an event, but a real holiday, capable of being remembered for a long time. Taking a confident step forward, the man took a deep breath, collecting his thoughts, after which, after hesitating a little, he decided to ask his interlocutor a favor, hoping that he would agree to provide him with a small but extremely important service. The Baron, without waiting for his son-in-law to finish his speech, suddenly pointed his finger at him and loudly expressed his indignation, demanding that he finally tidy up his slovenly appearance, since his current appearance was unacceptable for a nobleman, and even more so for the future host of the banquet. The Duke froze, looking down in confusion, unable to find the right words, because he himself could not give a worthy explanation for why he had allowed himself to be in such a careless state. And now, under the watchful gaze of the senior aristocrat, he could only silently accept this fair reproach. Litera was deeply focused on signing important documents when a servant suddenly approached her and, with a respectful bow, informed her that a grand event was soon to take place, which, apparently, was to become a real event. Beside her stood a maid, whose face was beaming with a kind smile, and, folding her hands in front of her, she enthusiastically declared that this evening was intended as a surprise, carefully prepared by her master and all the household, in order to please Litera herself. With slight relief, the lady quietly exhaled, finally realizing the reason for her husband's strange behavior in recent days, because all this time he was clearly hiding something, behaving excitedly and mysteriously, and now everything fell into place. The long-awaited lady's preparations began, and soon a magnificent hem of an exquisite red dress, decorated with fine black lace, was spread out in front of the mirror, and golden patterns shimmered on its surface, giving the outfit a solemnity. The image was completed with exquisite brooches and precious jewelry sparkling on the fabric like a scattering of stars, giving the outfit sophistication and charm, and around her fragile shoulders fell a snow-white fur coat, the softness of which resembled fresh winter snow, emphasizing the aristocratic grandeur. Litera looked simply stunning. Her silky pink hair was neatly gathered into an elegant bun, delicate makeup emphasized her refined features, and long gold earrings sparkled gracefully in the candlelight, giving her appearance even more nobility. At this time, her husband was already waiting for her in the mansion, who this time looked completely different. His hair was carefully styled, his beard was neatly shaved, and his elegant suit fit him perfectly, making him a true embodiment of a gentleman, as even Litera herself had never seen him before. She looked at him in amazement, not hiding her slight shock, while he, slightly embarrassed by her attention, quietly muttered that her father had helped him tidy himself up and choose a decent outfit for such an important event, clearly proud of the result achieved. The young girl did not know what to say because her husband stood in front of her, but now he looked so amazingly handsome that her chest barely ached with excitement, and she only silently looked up at him, enchanted by his new image. Without thinking twice, Litera began to shower her companion with sincere compliments because he looked truly impressive, as if he had stepped out of an exquisite painting, and she could not hide her admiration for his renewed appearance. To his playful question about whether he now resembled a hothouse flower, grown with special care, the girl slyly narrowed her eyes, pretended to be angry, and, laughing playfully, began to lightly hit him in the chest, clearly hinting that he was being too modest. Meanwhile, the high society representatives had already gathered in the banquet hall, eagerly awaiting the appearance of the young couple, and when the massive doors finally swung open, the dazzling light of the chandeliers illuminated their figures, marking the beginning of the long-awaited evening. Litera's parents immediately rushed towards them and, exchanging a light laugh, could not help but reproach them, saying that they had already begun to doubt whether they would show up at all, since, apparently, their preparations had lasted so long that the guests had time to think that the evening would take place without the heroes of the occasion. Looking around at the assembled group in confusion, Litera asked in slight bewilderment why there were so many people around, since she had been sure that this evening was supposed to be a regular family dinner, and now what was happening caused her genuine surprise. It turned out that in addition to her parents, other guests connected with the Duke had been invited to the reception. Among them were his faithful knights, devoted servants, caring maids, and even some mutual acquaintances, which only added unexpected scope to the evening. Hearing his wife's cautious remark that it was not worth bothering so much, the man only smiled softly, looking at her with tenderness, and calmly replied that he had planned all this exclusively for her sake, striving to make this evening truly unforgettable and give her moments of sincere happiness. With a slight blush, the Duke muttered sheepishly that it was extremely important for him to show his wife how much he valued her, treasured every moment of her, and loved her with all his heart, even if he was not always able to express his feelings in words. He looked away in embarrassment and mechanically began to finger his other hand, as if trying to calm his inner excitement, and looking timidly at Litera, quietly asked if he had really gone overboard with the scale of the celebration, and that all this seemed excessive to her. Litera gracefully curved her lips into a soft smile. Her gaze flashed with a mischievous sparkle, and with a slight mockery in her voice she said that finally, Ferris began to think not only about duty and obligations, but also about himself, about his desires, which of course was worthy of praise. With exquisite grace, she extended her hand in an elegant black glove, like a lady accustomed to balls, expecting to be invited to a slow, mysterious dance in which glances, movements, and breath would intertwine, creating a special atmosphere of barely perceptible magic. Tilting her head slightly to the side, she looked at him with an attentive, searching gaze, in which a slight shadow of playful coquetry shone, and with a charming softness in her voice, she asked whether her husband would agree to share this moment with her, to dance, dissolving in the music and rhythm. Ferris froze for a moment in indecision, feeling how his heart, not accustomed to such gentle gestures, began to beat a little faster, because he had never been skilled in such moments and, to be honest, did not expect such a direct invitation, which slightly embarrassed him. But, quickly pulling himself together, he smoothly stepped closer, with a slight trepidation took the lady's outstretched hand, barely noticeably touched it with his lips, observing the grace of the gesture, and, overcoming the remnants of his doubts, with dignity invited her to dance, opening himself to this moment with an unusual sincerity for himself. The noblewoman took a deep breath, holding it for a moment before saying with a barely perceptible smile that her husband was allowed to kiss her hand, because she had nothing against such gestures if they came from him, the man dear to her heart. Now, without losing a second, Ferris, with gentle tenderness, brought his wife's hand to his lips and, no longer holding back, touched it with a real kiss, this time allowing the feeling to express itself without limits, and then again, with an insistent tone in his voice, repeated his invitation to dance. Litera, without a moment's hesitation, accepted with genuine pleasure the opportunity extended to her to dissolve in the music next to her husband, and her contented, almost radiant face betrayed how close this moment was, how significant this simple touch was for both of them. The luxurious hall was immersed in the soft, flickering light of the candlesticks, reflected in the impeccably white walls and smooth, mirror-polished floor, creating an atmosphere of magic, where every step, every gesture seemed to be part of a well-thought-out and enchanting performance. A warm, confident male hand lay on the lady's graceful, fragile waist, and the next moment they were already circling in a smooth, mesmerizing waltz. Their movements were coordinated, as if they were dancing not for the first time, as if this moment was written for them in the very fabric of eternity. It was surprising how their relationship had changed over time, for when they first met, Littera had felt genuine fear of the Duke. Tall, cold, frightening, like a wild beast, whose gaze deprived her of the ability to breathe freely, and whose voice seemed like an echo of a thunderstorm. But now everything looked completely different. They were dancing like a truly loving couple, dissolving in the music and forgetting about everything in the world. The man was dressed not as a seasoned warrior, but as a nobleman, and his chosen one, shining with joy, resembled the heroine of a romantic fairy tale. The bride's father, unable to contain his emotions, wiped away the tears with the corner of a neatly folded handkerchief, genuinely happy for his daughter, while his wife, standing nearby, noted with a slight hint of mockery in her voice that he looked stupid. But he was far from the only one who could not hold back his tears, because even the stern men, knights and servants who accompanied the Duke could hardly hide their emotions, rejoicing for their master, and many of them, standing aside, wiped their eyes, not embarrassed by the fact that this moment touched them to the depths of their souls. Thinking about it, the woman couldn't help but agree that their daughter really did look happy next to her husband. Her eyes were shining with joy, and her smile was so sincere that even the most severe doubts dissipated, leaving only a warm feeling of calm in her soul. The Duke easily twirled the lovely lady around in a dance, and then, giving in to a huge impulse, lifted her into the air, causing her dress to flutter in soft waves, and at that moment their ringing laughter spread throughout the hall like a melody filled with pure, genuine joy. Later, going up to the balcony where a soft breeze played with the strands of her hair, the man and his beloved enjoying a private moment, lightly touched glasses filled with ruby-red juice and looked into each other's eyes, sharing this priceless moment. The Duke, without hiding his feelings, expressed sincere joy that his wife enjoyed the holiday, and she, with a warm smile and a sparkle in her eyes, replied that she was infinitely grateful to him for this evening, which became one of the most wonderful in her life. Having said goodbye to her parents, the beautiful and young girl watched them go until the carriage disappeared behind the gates, taking them back home, to the familiar world, leaving her here in a new life, among the palace light, music, and slowly flickering candles. Ferris seemed to have been transformed beyond recognition. His noble appearance was emphasized by rich, perfectly fitting clothes, and his long hair, neatly gathered in a ponytail, gave him even more sophistication, making him look not like a formidable warrior, but like a real aristocrat. The noblewoman, with a light, almost playful smile, watched her husband as if rediscovering him for herself, amazed at how amazingly his appearance had changed. Nobility and strength, aristocratic sophistication and unchanging imperiousness were now harmoniously intertwined in him. Suddenly, giving in to a playful impulse, she grabbed him by the chin and, looking closely at his face, began to turn his head first one way then the other as if studying every feature, to which Ferris asked in bewilderment if there was really something she didn't like about him. Looking the Duke over from all sides, Littera finally smiled even wider. Her gaze softened, and slightly bowing her head, she gave him a sincere compliment, noting that perhaps he himself did not notice it, but in such a guise he looked more than attractive. Leaning his hand on the balcony railing, he gazed thoughtfully into the night, reflecting on the words he had heard more than once in his life, that the blood of the imperial family flowed in his veins, that he belonged to a great family that carried within itself the glory and power of the past. From his childhood being a famous aristocrat, when his family was still alive, and even after their loss, those around him tirelessly told him what to do, how to live, what to be, as if his fate was written in advance, and his own opinion had no meaning. But one day everything changed. Still very young, he encountered a wild animal that attacked him, leaving deep wounds on his face, disfiguring his once flawless features. Since then, attention to him faded, because the former beauty disappeared, and in its place there were only scars, reminding him of that day. And only then did he finally realize that in high society, merit, strength, or character were not important. Among the aristocrats, appearance was above all else, and if it was gone, you ceased to be interesting, ceased to be worthy of admiration, and therefore, in their eyes, you ceased to exist. That was why the man had behaved so cruelly and mercilessly at the last ball. He hated all these hypocrites who smiled at him in the face but despised him behind his back. He considered their lies disgusting, and his own isolation, which had turned him into an outcast for years, had driven him to the brink. The Duke decided to live up to their expectations. If they saw him as a monster, then he became the monster they called him, grinning cruelly, making them afraid, trembling before him, enjoying their fear just as they once enjoyed his fall. Littera looked sadly at her husband, a strong, proud, but lonely man who had suffered such a difficult, bitter fate, filled with contempt and betrayal. Because no one tried to understand, no one looked deeper behind his cruel mask. Sometimes reality was not like a fairy tale, and if monsters appeared in this world, they were not created by themselves. People, with their words, actions, indifference, with their own hands turned a person into a beast, and then turned away in horror from the one they gave birth to. Littera, unable to contain her overwhelming feelings, threw herself into her husband's arms, clinging tightly to him as if hoping to warm him with her warmth, and whispered with sincerity in her voice that he should never have changed for her, because she loved him as he was. After these words, burying her face in his clothes, she barely audibly, but with genuine tenderness, whispered a promise that from now on he would no longer have to bear his heavy burden alone, because now he had her, the one who was ready to share with him both joys and pain. Being just a minor character in the book, Ferris existed only in the few lines allotted to him by fate, as if his story did not deserve more, as if he was just a shadow on the margins of someone else's grandiose and carefully thought-out story. But at that moment, when Littera tenderly ran her hand over his chin, gently outlining his sharp but noble features, he felt like not just a figure in someone's story, but a living person, worthy of warmth, care, and true devotion. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper in the stillness of the night, as she spoke words filled with sincerity. She didn't just want to be there, she wanted to protect him and the place where he grew up, his past, his present, his fragile hopes, everything that was dear to him. Hearing the question of whether he would allow her to do this, the man froze, and a moment later he blushed so much that even the cold night air could not hide the heat that engulfed his face. Because no one had ever spoken to him so tenderly before, no one had offered to be his support and light in this endless darkness. Holding his hand near the head of his beloved, whose pink curls shimmered softly in the moonlight, he said firmly, but with warm sadness in his voice, that he had no right to resist her, no right to object to her words, because his heart already belonged to her completely. Without hesitation, he pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her close as if he wanted to protect her from the world, as if he hoped that in this moment they could hide from the past, that his warmth could say more than any words. And Littera, feeling the beating of his heart, the trembling strength of his hands, firmly decided for herself. If someone dares to hurt this stern but surprisingly sensitive man, her only one, the one who suffered alone for so long, then these people will beg for death, and she will not leave them without an answer. The night enveloped them in its velvet cover, hiding them from prying eyes, and above their heads stretched the endless starry sky, winking with millions of lights, as if fate itself blessed their vows, sealed not with words, but with the beating of two hearts that found each other in the middle of the world. The high society nobles discussed political marriages with enthusiasm and undisguised curiosity, whispering about how the powerful Duke of the North had taken as his wife only the daughter of a baron, which seemed strange to many, if not to say ridiculous and completely senseless. Some aristocrats shook their heads in bewilderment, not understanding why such an influential nobleman would tie the knot with a woman who was considered crazy, and moreover, why he would waste his strength, time, energy, and even perhaps his precious patience on her. One of the wealthy young gentlemen, thoughtfully sipping wine from an exquisite glass, reminded his interlocutors that the blood of the imperial family flowed through the veins of the Duke of Severus, and no matter how his fate turned out, forgetting this would be an unforgivable and imprudent mistake. Meanwhile, a cautious, barely audible knock was heard on the smooth wooden surface of the door, and a soft but confident female voice politely and calmly asked if she could come inside, as if she had no idea that people had been whispering about her behind these walls for a long time. When Ferris, sitting at his desk, barely looking up from his papers, allowed entry, Littera gracefully stepped over the threshold, smiling at the corners of her lips and quietly saying that she had nothing urgent or important. She just wanted to ask him one small but curious question. However, her attention was instantly drawn to an unexpected detail, which made her freeze in place with her lips parted in surprise, as if something impossible had opened up before her, something from another world, so unusual and fascinating that even her breathing became confused for a moment. Ferris wore glasses. He had never been seen wearing them before, and so now he looked completely different. Elegant, even somewhat mysterious, like a scientist, a wise strategist, or a thoughtful philosopher, and not a stern warrior and formidable Duke of the North, as those around him were accustomed to seeing him. Catching her surprised look, the man bowed his head slightly and, adjusting his glasses on the bridge of his nose with a confident movement, admitted with a slight hint of embarrassment that he only wears them when he has to read too much and sort through tedious, endless documents. The lady, smiling playfully, said with graceful ease to her frightened interlocutor that, it seemed, time was inexorably taking its toll, and he must have begun to grow old, since he reacted so sharply to innocent jokes that previously did not cause him any embarrassment or anxiety. The nobleman sank into a chair with visible melancholy and resignation, staring into space, when he finally realized that the lady was not trying to support his mood at all, but on the contrary, was playfully teasing him, watching as his self-confidence faded under the pressure of her light, but accurate ridicule. Leaning closer to her husband, touching his hand with a warm touch, she asked in a quiet but expressive voice if there had been any nobles of late whose restless presence might disturb their union or cast a shadow of doubt on the strength of their marriage. Taking a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility on himself, Ferris nodded reservedly, acknowledging that as a man with the blood of the emperor flowing through his veins, he was inevitably under the watchful eyes of those around him, looking for weakness or fatal error in him. Littera, playfully poking her finger into her chest, with a slight reproach and a sly smile, asked if her husband was really so immersed in his own affairs that in the endless whirlpool of duties and worries, he could not find even a moment to give her even a drop of attention. After thinking for a moment, the noblewoman suddenly knelt before her husband with a determination that left no room for hesitation, and, seizing the papers lying before him, began to read them, not paying attention to his surprise, for he was completely dumbfounded. Blushing and barely containing his indignation, the Duke attempted to object, but before the words had escaped his lips, he was interrupted by his wife, whose intonation was full of reproach and barely perceptible bitterness, when she asked directly if her presence had become so unbearable for him. Covering his face with his hands, he could not hide his embarrassment, realizing that all attempts to persuade the girl to get up from his lap were in vain, while she, on the contrary, looked quite pleased with her actions and with obvious pleasure began to help her husband sort out the documents. As she glanced over the rows of text, she noticed that among the entries there were many familiar names of aristocrats whose deeds and plans were often the subject of heated discussions in high society, making her wonder about the meaning of these documents. Gently running her hand along the edge of the paper, then casually placing it back on the table, Littera announced with a slight grin that she had seen in these notes everything she wanted to know, and now her curiosity was completely satisfied, although her look said otherwise. With a slight, almost innocent smile, the girl leaned closer and, with a sly gleam in her eyes, asked her beloved if he wanted the same as she did, because if he agreed, then she would make sure that these despised rich people, and along with them, 3 more generations of their heirs. The Duke, listening with obvious awkwardness to his wife's passionate speeches, did not know how to react to her unyielding desire to take revenge on those who had once done him harm, and although his heart trembled at her determination, something in her words made him feel uneasy. However, when the lady uttered the terrible truth that in a past life all these scoundrels had stabbed his beloved in the back without hesitation, a cold numbness flooded his consciousness, and for a moment he froze, realizing what dark truth was hidden behind these names. Without a moment's hesitation, he took off his glasses with a sharp movement, his gaze darkened with anger, and his voice, breaking into a dull roar, uttered the only promise. He would destroy these self-proclaimed aristocrats, grind them into dust and spare not a single one for her sake. Embracing her lover, the girl gently but persistently tried to convince him that their revenge should be sophisticated and unnoticeable, that acting openly meant giving the enemies a chance to defend themselves, and therefore it was wiser to weave webs of intrigue, invisibly undermining their power. Ferris, thirsting for consolation, with a quiet sigh pressed himself against the woman's large breast, as if seeking in her warmth salvation from the gloomy thoughts that had overwhelmed him, and feeling how the enormous anxiety melted under the gentle touch, he allowed himself to forget himself for a moment in her caress. With a barely perceptible smile, the magnificent girl, like a fatal villainess, leaned towards his ear and with her lips alone, whispered a promise in which there was a dangerous pleasure. They would turn the life of these scoundrels into an endless nightmare from which they would have no escape. After that, gently but firmly hugging the guy with her arms, she leaned closer and with a barely perceptible playfulness in her voice, asked her precious knight not to interfere with her game and just trust her, because from now on, everything had to go according to her rules. Suddenly her gaze caught on something strange, and without thinking twice she reached out to the document lying haphazardly on her desk, feeling an inexplicable anxiety, as if this paper concealed something important that should not escape her attention. As soon as she took the document in her hands, her face distorted with bewilderment. The handwriting was so illegible that even with all the desire it was impossible to make out a single word, which meant that the entire contents remained a mystery to her, which caused not anxiety but irritation. Understanding her confusion, the man, visibly embarrassed, reluctantly admitted that this horrible handwriting was his own, officially used in moments of excitement, when he could not control the trembling in his hand, and therefore it came out as if someone ignorant had written. The lady, in shock, looked at the document with disbelief until his next words reached her. He had deliberately written the letters so ugly that those around him would consider him an uneducated savage, incapable of either cunning or calculation, and this discovery was astonishing. The man's hand, involuntarily betraying internal tension, gripped the armrest of the chair tighter, as if trying to hold on to something solid amidst the chaos of thoughts that were whirling through his head, leaving behind only a dull anxiety and a barely restrained whirlwind of emotions. Hearing that no one had ever seen his real handwriting before, the girl raised her head in surprise, because in his past life he had written her letters so often, and his calligraphy was truly beautiful, like the trace of an elegant pen sliding across fragile silk. Remembering how once in a past life he invariably sent her letters full of warmth and tender feelings, the girl smiled thoughtfully, because his handwriting was so refined and elegant that it seemed as if the letters were laid on paper with the blessing of the muse herself. Feeling her husband's trust and tenderness, the beauty happily pressed herself against him even tighter, enjoying the warmth of his embrace, because he behaved with her so tenderly and carefully that her heart sank, and her soul was filled with a feeling of comfort, as if she had finally found the long-awaited peace. The Duke, full of determination, promised with a slight smile that even now, despite all the trials, his beloved would remain special to him, unique and priceless, like a precious stone shining even in the thickest darkness. But in fact, the man always wrote in his letters that he was ready to discuss this issue only at a personal meeting, as if he wanted to maintain the intrigue, not allowing her thoughts to fade away and the anticipation to dry up, filling each message with hidden meaning and subtle hints. The noblewoman reflected with slight resentment on the injustice of the situation. He had kept her letters, filled with revelations and feelings, but she did not have even a single line written by his hand, as if fate itself did not allow her to capture his words on paper. What seemed strange, however, was that the crown prince, being a jealous man who did not tolerate rivals, allowed his wife to maintain her friendship with the mysterious duke for 5 years without stopping it, as if there was a secret between them that only he knew about. Disappointedly recalling her ex-husband, the lady explained that he simply did not see the man with whom she corresponded as a real threat, and therefore did not even feel jealous, considering him something insignificant, not worthy of attention or concern. The prince, being a narcissistic, handsome man, accustomed to admiring glances, perceived his ex-wife's friendship with the formidable beast of the north as nothing less than an act of her mercy and kindness, as if she were condescendingly paying attention to someone who, in his opinion, was lower than her in status. The noblewoman was annoyed and angry with herself for having been too young and naive in her youth, allowing herself to connect her life with this empty-headed, self-absorbed idiot, not noticing the obvious signs of his insignificance, which now seemed more than obvious to her. Listening to the curses his wife was hurling at the royal person, Ferris blushed so much that even his ears burned because he could not even imagine that a woman from a noble family was capable of knowing such words, and even more so pronouncing them out loud with such fire in her voice. Suddenly a voice was heard behind the closed door, informing the Duke that an unexpected guest had arrived, and although the words were spoken evenly and with restraint, there was a barely noticeable hint of respect in them, as if the visitor were a person of no small importance. The intrigued noblewoman wondered with curiosity who could have come to their castle at such a late hour, continuing to sit on her husband's lap, while he, remaining unperturbed, calmly noted that, apparently, the guest had already crossed the gate and would soon appear before them. A moment later, after a brief permission, a foot stepped over the threshold of the room, and a tall silhouette paused at the entrance before quietly but confidently greeting the master of the palace, whose figure seemed majestic and unwavering in the soft candlelight. Before them stood a priest, a gray-haired old man in immaculate white robes, whose gaze radiated calm and peace, and in his voice there was a slight hope that the nobleman he had come to visit was still in good health and well-being. The priest cast a penetrating, searching glance at the young couple, tilted his head slightly to one side, as if thinking, then, with a slight hint of doubt in his voice, asked if Ferris really had something so urgent that it required a meeting at such a late and seemingly inopportune hour. Realizing that he might have unwittingly interrupted the husband and wife in some indecent intimacy, the priest hastened to take a step back, intending to tactfully leave. But at that very moment he was stopped by the firm hand and commanding voice of the aristocrat who ordered him to remain where he was. Somewhat embarrassed, the adult Ferris awkwardly admitted that he had actually called the clergyman for his wife's sake, which greatly surprised the lady, who had not expected that her husband would seek help from such a respected person specifically for her sake. The priest, being the Duke's confidant and a man to whom he could entrust even the most intimate, really possessed knowledge that could help the young woman cope with her poor health, which was the reason for his unexpected visit. The priest bowed politely to the Duchess, respectfully acknowledging her presence, and noticing that before him was the very woman he had read about in the Duke's letters, he quietly spoke words of greeting, expressing his gratitude for their long-awaited reunion. The priest warmly congratulated the young couple, expressing his admiration for the fact that they had managed to overcome all the difficulties and, despite the obstacles, find each other, linking their destinies. This was not only a great blessing, but also an important, significant moment for all those gathered. The old man then gently extended his hand to the girl's head to perform a ritual of checking her health, using magic filled with a sleek light that emitted a gentle glow, as if nature itself was an ally in this sacred act, directing its power to help. Feeling a light touch of magic, the noblewoman softly closed her eyes, feeling her body fill with warm light, as if she found herself in a house surrounded by comfort and safety, where her heart was filled with an unusual but deep feeling of peace and tranquility. The priest, taking a deep breath, expressed his opinion, stating that he saw in her a hidden power and the remnants of the sacred presence of God, as if the divine power itself was protecting this woman and filling her with vital energy, which caused him deep respect. Soon the saint came to the profound conclusion that the lady had undoubtedly experienced considerable suffering in childhood, and that her present state of mind was a consequence of the severe trials she had endured during those difficult and tragic years of her life. After this, the old man added that the lady was in generally good health, but her endurance left much to be desired, and there was another detail that greatly disturbed him and made him truly worry, that the anxiety did not leave him for a long time. The young couple, slightly embarrassed and surprised, stood in awkward silence when they were informed that they had to be much less open with each other in bed than they had originally intended, which added even more awkwardness to their relationship. The room looked like something mysterious, shrouded in semi-darkness, where the old fireplace stood without fire, and next to it a small table was neatly placed, on which a small order was arranged with other objects, creating an atmosphere of coziness and mystery. Raising his hands in front of him, the priest explained that if they were often close, the blessing of the Virgin would be restored, as would the strength of her soul, which would help to restore her inner harmony and restore her lost abilities, allowing her to regain strength and confidence. This surprised the couple in love because they did not expect such a result, which was completely unexpected for them, but at the same time encouraging and perhaps even alarming, leaving them in deep thought about the future and its consequences. Hugging her husband Littera, she asked if it was enough, to which the priest, after thinking, replied that the difference was indeed noticeable, but it was not enough for a full restoration, and it would take a little more time for the full effect. But when the aristocrat was dying in her previous life, this beauty made two important wishes: to be reincarnated in a new body, to find a second chance, and, of course, to meet the Duke, whom she dreamed about and with whom she had long corresponded. The girl, without wasting time and without hiding anything, immediately told her husband everything, honestly explaining to him what exactly had become her cherished goal and what she expected from this meeting, hoping that her ambitious and bold plans would come true in the best possible way, despite all the difficulties. Ferris, hearing her frank confession, blushed brightly. The man's face immediately became covered with a blush, and he understood what she was talking about earlier, realizing the full depth of her intentions, which confused him a little, but did not leave him indifferent, causing mixed feelings. The priest waved his hand, as if dismissing the whole situation, and said with calm confidence that they should simply watch how things would develop, and then he would visit the Duchess from time to check on her condition and important decisions. Silently, deep in thought, Littera thought that if her blessing was truly restored, she would be able to do much more than she was currently doing, gaining strength and opportunities that would open up new horizons for her. The documents fell onto the table with a reporting noise, scattering across the surface. Their fall seemed to emphasize the importance of completing everything that had been planned, and added a certain solemnity and significance to the moment for all participants in the process. Young Littera happily said that the work had been successfully completed for the day, and her husband praised her by gently clapping his hands, thereby expressing recognition of her efforts and achievements, which was a sincere sign of approval and deep respect for her work. The aristocrat said with a sincere smile that all this became possible thanks to their well-coordinated teamwork, and added that her husband was a true genius, whose ideas and actions became the basis for achieving such amazing and significant results. The man muttered darkly that, thanks to his endless education as a child, he could do all this work in his sleep without much effort, as the knowledge and skills became part of his daily life and seemed almost natural. Looking thoughtfully into the distance, the Duke suggested that they should go for a walk now, to take a little break from all the work and give themselves time to think, enjoying a moment of peace and quiet before the storm came, threatening everyone around. Gray clouds floated slowly across the sky, creating a gloomy yet mesmerizing atmosphere, filling the air with the harbinger of changes that could soon overtake everyone in this place, preparing them for something important. The girl looked at the village with interest, being on the Duke's territory for the first time, feeling something new and unknown, while the snow quietly fell from above, creating a light, almost magical atmosphere around, which completely absorbed her attention, like in some fairy tale. The only thing that bothered her was her husband's outfit, armor and a sword, as if he had gone out not for a walk, but for a hunt, preparing for battle, and this seemed a little strange for such a warm and peaceful environment where there was no place for violence, aggression, and unexpected threats. When his wife asked if she should also take a weapon with her, her husband answered with a smile that she did not need to worry or be concerned about this because he was there and would always protect her, even if it meant risking himself, standing guard over her safety. With a wide smile and complete confidence, he promised that he would protect her no matter what the circumstances, assuring her that his care for her was the most important thing, and he would not need anything more than to be there in any situation. The beauty saw her husband so self-confident for the first time, and therefore was impressed, surprised by his determination and strength, which radiated from his posture and gaze, making her feel proud of her chosen one, and not doubt his incredible power. The man took a quick step forward, his boots hitting the ground with a dull thud, and he said that he always won battles without losing confidence, as if no force in the world could stop him, and such victories were a natural and undeniable state of life for him. With her mouth wide open, Littera listened as this beast of the north said that if his lands were ever conquered, it would only happen after his death, because he was ready to defend them until his last breath, despite any obstacles or difficulties. The girl could not believe her ears when he added that he wanted to give her all his lands, promising her unconditional power and influence, which made her future more amazing and exciting than she could even imagine, opening up boundless horizons of possibilities before her. The city became her new home, where the beautiful noblewoman could live, love, and rule, surrounded by the care and support of her husband, where her every decision could influence the future, and everything around was under her power and organization, giving her a feeling of complete security. Her husband's body was covered with many scars left from fierce battles and bloody battles, which emphasized not only his incredible bravery, but also the difficult trials he had to go through while surviving in these cruel worlds. Remembering the details of that brutal battle with her husband, when his torso was naked, covered with numerous scars, Littera felt her face fill with a flame of embarrassment, and a wave of awkwardness mixed with slight bewilderment arose in her chest. She quickly waved her hand in the air, as if trying to drive away all the indecent thoughts and images that were trying to take over her mind, and noticing her obvious embarrassment, Ferris asked excitedly if everything was okay with her, worried about her condition. Littera strode forward resolutely, insisting that they should reach their destination before dark, so as not to waste time, not to expose themselves to unnecessary danger, and to use the last rays of daylight before they disappeared as a reminder of time. An exquisite picture appeared before them. Before them was a white, long, and large fountain, in which there was no water, but its graceful forms still attracted attention, as if reminding of a long-gone time, and the people who once enjoyed its beauty and grandeur. The Duke explained to the lady that since they lived in cold climates, the fountain did not function because the water froze, and this monument became only a symbol of the past, deprived of life and warmth in such harsh and merciless conditions, where every movement was important. Inside the monument, one could see many silver coins left by people who threw them into the fountain in hopes of good luck, as if they believed that even frozen water could still fulfill their cherished wishes and dreams, carrying them away to distant lands. Coughing into his hand, the man explained that the townspeople used to throw their money into the fountain, believing it would bring good luck, and then he would take the coins as taxes, turning the act into a certain tradition, with everyone having a role to play in the ritual. Pointing his finger at the fountain, he suggested that the lady try tossing a coin and making a wish, as if the customs of the place could grant her something more than just a gesture. Littera accepted with a smile, feeling the light magic of the moment envelop her. The gold coin, its shine dazzling and alluring, neatly joined the silver ones, creating an enchanting sound that seemed to bounce off the walls, causing an echo in the empty hall, filling the atmosphere with a mysterious and almost magical world. With her hands folded in front of her, the lady, with inexpressible sadness in her eyes, began to pray to God, begging him to quickly free her soul from the burden of life, to finally grant her the long-awaited end and free her from inevitable suffering. Her husband, who stood nearby, watched her behavior in complete bewilderment, not understanding how it was possible to make such wishes to the Almighty, as if death could be an easy solution and not the last step on this long path. Looking down at the floor, the Duke, thinking about his situation, decided to make a wish too, but a completely different one than his wife. He hoped for something that could change his fate, adding new strength to his dubious decision. He waved his hand, clad in an elegant glove of soft leather, as if making a majestic gesture that attracted the attention of everyone present. This movement was not just an expression of power, but also a moment filled with mystery and foreshadowing. The second gold coin, as if fulfilling the will of its owner, with a loud and distinct sound that broke the silence, quickly fell down, rolling across the cold stone floor, creating an echo that sounded in the air for a long time, filling it with magic. He wished that his wife, standing next to him, would live a long, happy, and prosperous life, much more joyful and bright than the fate of the girl who was next to him, and a feeling of awkwardness and inner anxiety flashed through his heart. Quietly, Ferris agreed with the idea that at the end of life it is important to find peace and find long-awaited tranquility, to leave all worries behind, to stop worrying about the bustle of the world, and to enjoy quiet, peaceful days when the mind and heart can finally rest from the storms. However, after a short pause, he added, without taking his eyes off his wife, that if she continued to worry so much and dwell on this, then she might miss out on her whole life, passing by true happiness, joy, and inner harmony. The lovely lady blushed in embarrassment, her face lit up with color, and she quickly looked away, realizing that he was absolutely right, that her feelings were completely unjustifiable, and she should have acted differently at this difficult and awkward moment in her life. Embarrassed, she grabbed her husband's cloak with her hand, pulling it towards herself, as if trying to hide from all the surrounding gazes, wanting to hide in the shadows, although she was perfectly aware that this would not save her from what was happening violently in her heart and mind at this anxious moment. Hiding her face behind his clothes, she insistently said that now, in her opinion, he should also make a wish, because now he would also have to think about himself, not only about her, and fulfill his own request at this important and exciting moment in their lives. Ferris glanced at his wife in bewilderment, not understanding what exactly he could be wrong about, because everything he did seemed so simple, natural, and sincere, and it was difficult for him to understand why she took it so unexpectedly and completely differently than he expected. The irritated noblewoman turned away sharply and, almost shouting, declared that he should think more about himself and not about others, since her feelings and desires at that moment seemed to go unnoticed, and his concerns about others were too intrusive and restless. Her pink hair fluttered in the wind as she sank into deep thought, thinking about how she was afraid to ever reciprocate the Duke's feelings with love again after going through a painful relationship with a bad prince who ultimately betrayed her and cruelly abandoned her, leaving her with scars. And now this man, the Duke, with his endless care, tenderness, and affection, embraced her, consoled her like no one else, showing such sincere and selfless care that she became increasingly lost in her feelings, not understanding how her heart was gradually and inevitably leaning towards him. Closing her eyes and snuggling her nose into his warm cloak, she realized that, despite all her fears and doubts, feelings were awakening in her soul more and more strongly, and she involuntarily began to fall in love with this man, with whom she did not want to fall in love so strongly again.